Chapter 1, Surviving, 1. Outside of time. March, the beginning of spring. At a corner of the eastern part of Nanhuang * continent, the hazy sky was a stretch of grey and black, emitting a heavy sense of oppression. It was as if someone had splattered ink on drawing paper, allowing the ink to soak the sky, smudging the clouds. The clouds folded over each other, merging together. After that, streaks of red lightning could be seen shooting out, accompanied by thunderous rumbling sounds. The sounds were akin to the low-sounding roars of gods reverberating through the mortal world. The blood-colored rain emanated sorrow, falling onto mortal soil. In the vast land, there was a ruined city. It looked devoid of vitality as it sat silently under the hazy blood-colored rain. Within the fragmented city walls, desolation and dilapidation painted the scene bleak. Everything was withering, and collapsed houses could be seen everywhere. One could also find numerous greenish-black corpses and torn flesh around that resembled crumbling autumn leaves as they silently withered. The once bustling streets were now in shambles. The sandy paths that were once crowded with people were now silent. The only things that remained were shredded flesh, dust, and paper mixed with blood-soaked mud to the extent that one was indistinguishable from another. It was an extremely shocking sight. Not far away, a broken carriage could be seen deep in the mud. Degrees of deterioration could clearly be seen on it, and the only thing there was an abandoned bunny puppet that was tied onto the carriage's shaft, gently swaying with the wind. Its white-colored fur was long dyed red, exuding a gloomy and eerie aura. Its cloudy eyes seemed to contain some resentment as it stared lonely at the mottled stones ahead. A figure could be seen lying there. This was a youth that seemed around 13 to 14 years old. His clothes were tattered and filled with dirt. Also, there was a damaged leather pouch tied to his waist. The youth squinted his eyes as he lay there unmoving. The bone-piercing chill seeped through the holes of his clothes from all directions, enveloping his entire body, gradually causing his body temperature to dip. But even when the rain fell onto his face, he didn't blink. He was coldly staring at a place far away like an eagle. If one followed his gaze, at a location roughly 7 to 8 jong * away, there was a skinny vulture currently chewing the rotting corpse of a wild dog. It would occasionally cast a vigilant glance at its surroundings. It felt like in this ruined city where danger abounded, the moment a slight gust of wind caused the grass to sway, the vulture would instantly soar into the air. The youth was like a hunter, patiently waiting for his chance. A long time later, an opportunity came. The greedy vulture finally completely buried its head into the wild dog's stomach to feast. Hence, the youth instantly narrowed his eyes as a cold light could be seen gleaming within. His body shot forward like a fired arrow, dashing rapidly ahead for the vulture. His right hand stretched to the leather pouch on his waist and pulled a black-colored iron stick out. The tip of the iron stick glimmered with cold sharpness. Maybe it was the vulture's perception of killing intent, but at the moment the youth dashed forth, it immediately became aware. Due to fright, it flapped its wings and wanted to take off for the safety of the air. However, it was too late. The black iron stick, as the youth with a face devoid of emotions lightly tossed it, transformed into a black line that erupted forth. Pu! The sharp iron stick instantly pierced into the vulture's head, breaking its skull and killing it in one strike. The powerful impact blasted the vulture back, finally pinning it onto the horse carriage not far away. As a result, the blood-soaked bunny puppet also moved due to the collision impact and began swaying. The youth showed a calm look. From the start until now, his speed didn't reduce at all. He dashed toward the horse carriage and grabbed the vulture's corpse and iron stick. His strength was great enough to break apart a small piece of the carriage at the location where the vulture was pinned earlier. After doing all these, he didn't even turn his head as he rapidly headed toward the streets. At this moment, the wind here seemed to blow even stronger. The blood-colored puppet on the carriage seemed to be observing the departing back of the youth as it swayed in the wind. He moved further and further. The wind indeed grew stronger. It brought along the chill in the rain and blew past the thin clothes that the youth was wearing. The youth involuntarily shivered. After that, he furrowed his brow slightly and wrapped his clothes tighter around him as the sound of breathing could be heard. He hated the cold, and the solution to resist the cold was to find a place that could block the wind and rain to rest. However, the currently running youth didn't reduce his speed at all as he passed by numerous tattered-looking shops. He didn't have much time left because the hunting of the vulture had taken too much time. He still had a place he had to go today. It shouldn't be far now, the youth muttered to himself and continued sprinting in the streets. On his way, numerous greenish-black corpses could be seen everywhere. Their faces that were devoid of hope were filled with malice, causing them to emanate an aura of despair that threatened to taint the youth's spirit. However, the youth treated this as normal and didn't even bother to spare a glance at them. Some time passed. The youth would occasionally glance at the sky as anxiousness appeared on his face. It seemed like the darkening sky was more frightening to him compared to the corpses. Luckily, he saw a medical shop in the distance not long later. The youth then heaved a sigh of relief and rushed over there. The medical shop wasn't big and many medicine cabinets were lying on the ground, emitting the stench of mold. It was like a tomb that had been forced open by others, and everything in there was a mess. Also, there was the corpse of an old man in the corner. It was completely greenish-black and sat there with its back to the wall. The corpse's eyes were wide open as though the owner didn't die peacefully. It was listlessly staring at the world outside. The youth shot a glance at it when he entered, and he immediately began to search. The vast majority of the medicinal herbs had turned greenish-black like the corpses. Only a few were still normal. Among these normal medicinal herbs, the youth spent a long time identifying them. he seemed to be recalling his past experiences. Eventually, he picked a strand of golden soar grass up and removed his thin clothes, revealing a large wound across his chest. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Sight only. The wound hadn't completely recovered, and one could see the sides of the wound already starting to turn black. There was even some blood seeping out of the wound. The youth lowered his head to glance at the wound. After crushing the grass, he inhaled deeply and gritted his teeth before lifting his hand to smear the grass paste on his wound. In an instant, intense pain akin to a surging tide gushed forth from the wound, causing the youth to involuntarily shudder. However, he forcibly endured it. Even so, there was no way for him to stop the sweat from emerging on his forehead. The droplets of sweat then began flowing down his face, dripping onto the dark ground. 1 Nanhuang can be literally translated as Southern Phoenix. 2 1 Zhang equals 3.3 meters. Chapter 2, Surviving. 2. Outside of time. The tears formed small spots of water akin to ink on the dark ground. The entire process persisted for over 10 breaths. After he finished smearing the medicinal herb paste over his wound completely, the youth seemed to have lost all his strength. He grabbed hold of a cabinet beside him and rested for quite some time before he exhaled deeply and slowly put on his clothes. He glanced at the sky outside again. After some contemplation, he took out a fragmented map from his leather pouch and opened it carefully. The map was very elementary, depicting the layout of this city. The medical shop's locations were all marked. In fact, in the northeastern area, many areas were crossed out by someone's fingernails. Only 2 areas on the map weren't crossed out yet. After searching for these few days, it should be inside one of these 2 remaining areas. The voice of the youth was hoarse. He muttered in a low voice and was about to leave after putting the map away. However, before he left, he turned and glanced at the old man's corpse. His gaze then fell onto the clothes that it was wearing. That was a leather coat. Maybe it was because of some special quality of the leather, the degree of corrosion wasn't severe. The youth pondered and decided to walk over and remove the leather coat from the corpse before wearing it on his body. The coat was somewhat large, but after it enveloped his small and skinny frame, the youth finally felt a hint of warmth. Hence, he lowered his head and looked at the opened eyes of the old man and lifted his hand to gently brush across them, allowing the old man to close his eyes in death. Rest in peace, said the youth lightly. He tore down the curtains of the shop and covered the old man's corpse before turning to depart the medical shop. When he walked out, a weak glint of light flashed before his feet. The youth lowered his head and saw a palm-sized fragmented mirror piece in the blood-coated mud. In the mirror, he saw the reflection of his face. Although the face in the mirror was covered in dirt, one could still faintly see an extremely exquisite-looking face under the layer of dirt. However, it lacked the juvenile aura of the other ordinary 13 to 14-year-olds. The immaturity was replaced by coldness. The youth silently looked at his reflection. A moment later, he lifted his foot and stumped down. Ka! Numerous cracks appeared on the fragmented mirror. After smashing the mirror, his body moved as he sped into the distance. On the ground, although the fragmented mirror had even more cracks now, it still reflected the sky. The reflected sky resembled half of a vast fragmented human face from the gods that seemed to cover the entire world and all lives. The fragmented face had its eyes closed with a cold and lofty expression. Strands of withered curly hair draped down below. This fragmented face was a natural existence akin to the sun and moon of this world. It was as though it was saying that all existences below the gods were ants and insects. The living habits and lifestyle of the myriad of creatures had no choice but to change under their influence. And at this moment, the sky also gradually lost its light under the face of gods reflected in the mirror. The shadow of the setting sun was like a black mist that pervaded the ruins in the city, covering the entire land as though wanting to devour it. After that, the rain grew even heavier. As the dark night gradually devoured everything, the wind was as strong as ever and would occasionally cause sharp whimpering sounds to ring out. The sounds resembled the howls of malicious ghosts, awakening all the bizarre existences in this city. The wind then continued making bone-chilling creepy noises one after another. Hearing this, the running youth ran even faster and his movements grew more hurried. He agilely passed through the streets, trying to outpace the descent of the night. Just as he passed a collapsed house and was about to continue speeding ahead, the eyes of the youth abruptly narrowed. From the corner of his eyes, he spotted someone amidst the rubble. From afar, the person's clothing was neat and there seemed to be no injuries on his body. That person was seated there with his back against the wall. The most important thing was that the revealed skin of that person was normal-colored and not greenish-black. In this city, unless one was alive, it was impossible for such a figure to appear. And people who were alive, during these few days, the youth had not met a second living person other than himself. This scene caused his mind to stir. Very soon, it seemed that he thought of something and his breathing grew hurried. He had the intention to go forward, but the darkness of night behind him akin to smog appeared and was about to engulf him. The youth hesitated a little. He then made a mental note about this location before he quickly left. He sprinted all the way and finally returned to his temporary dwelling in this city before the night caught up to him. This place was a cave with a very small interior, and it was filled with bird feathers. The gap that was the entrance wasn't large. Adults had no way to come in, and only youths might be able to enter forcibly if they squeezed. After entering, he blocked the entrance with miscellaneous items such as books and rocks with great familiarity. Right after the gap was completely blocked, the darkness of the night gushed over. At this moment, the youth didn't let go of his vigilance. His hand forcefully clutched the iron stick as he held his breath, squatting there to listen for a long time. Gradually, the roars of mutated beasts and a piercing sound rang out, occasionally mixed in with eerie laughter. After that, there was even a clearer sounding roar that echoed out in reply. Because of the nervous state of the youth, he only relaxed and sat at the side after the voices passed him by and faded into the distance. The interior of the cave was covered in complete darkness. The youth silently sat there, and it felt as though time could stop at this moment. He then fell into a daze and calmed his frayed nerves. After that, he grabbed a water flask beside him and gulped down a few mouthfuls of water, ignoring the sounds outside as he took the vulture out from his pocket. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Site only. In the darkness, he began to chew on the vulture bit by bit. A disgusting bloody and fishy stench then gushed forth from his throat, but he calmly chewed on and swallowed, forcing the food down to his stomach. And at this moment, his stomach was forcefully churning, trying to digest and alleviate the feeling of hunger. Very soon, he finished the entire vulture. The youth then drew in a deep breath as waves of fatigue flooded his body. His eyes also slowly closed. However, his hand still held the black-colored iron stick tightly, as though he was a lone wolf taking a nap. Outside of Time Chapter 3, Surviving. 3. Outside of Time. It was as though he would open his eyes instantly the moment there was anything strange. At this moment in the outside world, darkness was like a curtain, enveloping the city, the land, and the sky. The world under the sky was extremely vast. The Nanhuang continent, which was situated overseas, was just one of the continents. Only a few people knew exactly how large this world was. However, the imposing fragmented face above the sky emanated intense intimidation, and everyone could see it by lifting their head. It was no longer known what was the exact time the fragmented face arrived in this world. Humans only knew that very long ago, from the descriptions recorded in some texts, this world that was filled with immortal chi was prosperous and flourishing with vitality, but it only lasted until this gigantic fragmented face, which brought with it destruction, was attracted over from the depths of the void. In the process of its arrival, all lives in this world used all their methods and attempted to stop it, but everyone failed. In the end, only a few ancient kings and sovereigns brought part of the human race to relocate, abandoning the rest of the life forms here. Not long later, the fragmented face arrived. It hung suspended in the sky, and from then on, a nightmare descended. The aura from the face permeated the entire world. Mountains, seas, all objects, and the myriad of life, even cultivators and the spirit energy they used to cultivate were tainted. Everything withered, and all lives were extinguished. The survival rate was less than 1%. From then on, the humans who survived with great difficulty from this calamity referred to this fragmented face as a god. They also termed this world as Ensoil. As for the places the ancient kings and sovereigns relocated to, they were known as Holy Lands. These terms of address had lasted through many eras and were passed down through each generation. Also, the disasters brought by the gods weren't just these. The fragmented face's imposing intimidation would oppress all sentient beings constantly. Every few years, a few decades, or even a few centuries, the fragmented face would open its eyes once for several breaths. Every time it opened its eyes, the area it was staring at would instantly be tainted heavily by its aura. After that, all lives in that area would perish, and it would become an eternal forbidden zone. For the past few centuries, the number of forbidden zones in this world was increasing, and the places where the living could stay had become increasingly fewer. And 9 days ago, the god once again opened its eyes, and the location the fragmented face was staring at was none other than the area where the youth was staying. In this area, all species, and over 10 human cities regardless of their locations, including the slums inside or outside the cities, were instantly tainted heavily and became forbidden zones that prevented lives from existing. Under the terrifying taint, all lives directly dissolved into blood. Some of them mutated and became mutated beasts with no intellect. Meanwhile, the others turned into greenish-black corpses whose souls had thoroughly dispersed. Only very few humans and beasts managed to survive due to luck. The youth was one of these lucky survivors. At this moment, outside the dark cave, a shrill cry drifted from the distance and moved closer and closer to the cave. As a result, the youth who was asleep quickly opened his eyes. He instinctively lifted his hand that held the iron stick and stared at the blocked entrance gap warily. Only when the source of the shrill cry circled once in the vicinity and gradually moved further did the youth heave a sigh of relief. He had lost all desire for sleep. He then touched his leather pouch and removed a bamboo slip from within. In the darkness, he gingerly touched the words carved on the bamboo slip, and there seemed to be a gleam in his eyes. After that, he sat upright and closed his eyes to adjust his breathing. This youth's name was Xu Qing. He grew up alone and led an arduous life in the slums outside the city. 9 days ago, when the calamity suddenly appeared, he hid in this cave behind the gap between the rocks. Different from the frightened and crazed masses, he calmly looked at the fragmented face in the sky that was opening its eyes. From the god's gaze, he could see unique pupils that were in the shape of a cross. After that, he seemed to have lost the emotion of fear. It lasted until he saw a beam of purple light descending from the sky, landing in the northeastern area of the city. At the next moment, he slipped into unconsciousness. When he awoke, he became the only lucky survivor, be it inside or outside of the city. However, he didn't leave immediately. This was because he knew that when the god opened its eyes, this area would become a forbidden zone. At the start, it would be shrouded by blood rain and a boundary would be formed. Because of it, the people inside couldn't get out, and the people outside couldn't enter until the forbidden zone was completely formed. And the sign for completion was when the blood rain stopped. This calamity was nothing much to Xu Qing, who grew up in the slums. This was because, in the slums, everything, be it a vagrant, wild dogs, sickness, or a cold night, could easily cause one to lose their life. One could only survive with great difficulty. As long as he survived, nothing else mattered. Naturally, despite the cruelty in the slums, there would occasionally be a trace of warmth. For example, some scholars who were down on their luck would teach kids how to read for a living. Other than this, there were also the memories of his relatives. It was just that in Xu Qing's mind, the memories of his relatives faded as time passed. Despite him trying his best to remember, as he was afraid that he might forget, the memories he had of them gradually grew blurry. However, he knew that he wasn't an orphan and still had relatives somewhere. It was just that they had lost touch long ago, so, his dream was to continue surviving. If he could live slightly better, if he had the chance to meet with his kin, that would be for the best. Hence, he who had luckily survived chose to enter the city. He wanted to head to the dwellings of those rich men in the upper echelons of the city to find the things rumored in the slums, cultivation arts and methods that could strengthen one's body, as well as the beam of purple light that landed in the city. The shortcut to growing stronger had been circulating in the slums as rumors, and everyone thirsted for it. They called this practice cultivation, and those who grasped the methods of cultivation were known as cultivators. Hence, becoming a cultivator was Xu Qing's greatest wish other than meeting his relatives. Cultivators weren't a common sight. During these years at the slum, he had only seen cultivators entering the city once from afar. Cultivators had a typical characteristic. When ordinary people were observing them, their bodies would instinctively shiver. In fact, Xu Qing had even heard people saying that the city lord was a cultivator. Some of his guards were cultivators as well. Hence, after searching in the city for a long time, he finally found this bamboo slip on a corpse inside of the city lord's residence. However, that place was very dangerous. He suffered a wound on his chest at that time as well. Fortunately, the information recorded on the bamboo slip was the cultivation method he thirsted for. All its content had been memorized completely by him. In fact, he had begun attempting to cultivate during these few days. Xu Qing had never seen other cultivation arts before. This bamboo slip was his only gain. He also had no idea how to practice cultivation correctly. Luckily, the information on the bamboo slip was recorded in simple and easy to understand terms. It emphasized visualization and one's breathing. So, he proceeded step by step and had a few gains. This art was named the Mountains and Seas art. The method of cultivation was to visualize the totem carved on the bamboo slip and combine that with a special way of breathing. The picture of the totem was very strange, looking like a mutant. It had a large head and a tiny body with only a single leg. Moreover, its entire body was black and its face was as malevolent as a malicious ghost. Xu Qing had never seen such a life form before. The bamboo slip termed it as a xiao asterisk. At this moment, as he cultivated, the picture of the xiao appeared in his mind, and Xu Qing's breathing gradually changed. After that, undercurrents formed in the nearby air. The spirit energy in the surroundings flowed over and slowly entered his body, coursing through it. He also felt waves of bone-chilling coldness coursing through his body. Everywhere the cold feeling flowed, it felt like that body part was submerged in ice water. Xu Qing was afraid of the chill. However, he endured it and didn't give up, continuing to persevere. After a long time, when he finally ended this cultivation session after meeting the requirements on the bamboo slip, his body would be drenched in cold sweat. And despite having eaten a vulture not long ago, the sensation of hunger appeared once more in his stomach. Xu Qing wiped the cold sweat away and touched his stomach as determination flashed in his eyes. Ever since he cultivated this art, his appetite had evidently increased by a lot. His body was also more agile compared to the past. All of these allowed him to have a higher resistance to the icy chill that appeared during his cultivation. At this moment, he lifted his head and peered through the gap to look at the outside. In the outside world, it was pitch black. Only the sounds of terrifying roars that were sometimes weak and sometimes strong echoed in his ears. He didn't know why he became a lucky survivor. It might be due to luck or it might be due to the fact that he saw that beam of purple light. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Site only. So during these few days when he was searching for cultivation arts, he was also trying his best to find the location where the purple light fell in the northeastern area of the city. Sadly, he hadn't found anything. As he pondered, Xu Qing listened to the roars outside. His mind then involuntarily recalled the time before sunset when he saw the corpse that was leaning against the wall. His eyes slowly narrowed. The location of the corpse was in the northeastern area, and that body seemed like someone alive. Could it be that it has something to do with that purple light? A supernatural being from Chinese Folklore's Chapter 4, Anomalous Substances. Outside of time. If that person is alive, it might really have something to do with the purple light, but it might also be a trap. Xu Qing contemplated as he muttered to himself. During these few days in the ruined city, he deeply understood that those existences, who had transformed into mutated beasts due to the corruption by the god's aura, were all incomparably savage and boundlessly strong. However, maybe because the forbidden zone hadn't completely formed, these mutated beasts would be sleeping during the day. Unless it was like back then when he had obtained the bamboo slip. He had barged into the external perimeter of the location where they were sleeping. If not, as long as one was slightly more careful, there wouldn't be much problem. As opposed to them, Xu Qing was warier of living humans because sometimes, the human heart was even more treacherous compared to savage beasts. After pondering, his gaze slowly turned cold and sharp. Regardless of whether it was a living person or a trap, he was prepared to enter that area once again. But before he headed over, he had to be fully prepared. When he thought of this, Xu Qing clutched the cultivation bamboo slip in his hand tightly. During the cultivation these few days, the changes to his body allowed him to gain some confidence. The content of the bamboo slip involuntarily appeared in his mind. Other than the cultivation method, there was also an introduction to cultivation. Cultivation had been passed down from ancient times long before the god's fragmented face appeared. Now, although there were some changes, the overall system was still the same as in the past. It was categorized as qi condensation, foundation building, core formation, and nascent soul. As for the stages after nascent soul, maybe the cultivation realms were too high so the bamboo slip had no records. However, this clearly enlightened Xu Qing to the helplessness cultivators felt. This was because the god's aura had contaminated spirit energy, causing spirit energy to be tainted. This taint was like poison to all living things. It was unknown when it began, and everyone referred to the god's aura as anomalous substances. Xu Qing was very clear that the icy chill he felt during his cultivation earlier was actually due to the fact that the spirit energy he absorbed contained these anomalous substances. Once the anomalous substances were accumulated to a certain degree in the body, it would cause the cultivator to mutate. Either the cultivator would explode in a burst of blood or they would transform into a mutated beast with no intellect. As for the area the god gazed at when its eyes opened, the anomalous substances there would instantly increase explosively. In reality, it simply hastened the speed of the transformation. Danger existed in cultivation. If one didn't cultivate, the lifespan of humans in this end soil world that was polluted by God's aura was more to the lower end. In addition, sicknesses and diseases were more prevalent. It was as though they were living in the 9 levels of purgatory. Almost no one could have a good ending. The so-called cultivation became the only path. There were no more choices left. Hence, for countless years, humans inferred the cultivation methods through the generations based on what was passed down. The knowledge that was currently being disseminated was that when one absorbed the spirit energy, they should also make use of their cultivation art to separate the anomalous substances that mixed into the spirit energy before compressing them inside a certain part of their bodies. This location was known as the mutation point. Thus, the degree of separation for anomalous substances also became an important criterion to judge whether a cultivation art was good or bad. In addition, all the cultivation arts that could provide high degrees of separation were controlled by huge forces or powerful clans. These were their important resources. For this point, things were the same regardless of whether the gods arrived in this world or not. Since people would practice various cultivation arts, the degree of separation for anomalous substances would be different as well. Naturally, the locations of their mutation points would differ as well. However, no matter what, as long as one cultivated, their bodies would contain anomalous substances, and they would slowly form their mutation points. In theory, the mutation couldn't be reversed. One could only cleanse it through some medicinal pills, but the pills could only treat the symptoms and not the root of the problem. As for the method to completely purify the mutation point, the bamboo slip did have a sentence about it. In Ensoil, other than the Nanhuang continent, there was an even vaster continent named the Wanggu continent. It was the place of origin for the human race. Although the god's aura had also polluted that place, there seemed to be a way to completely cleanse the taint in the Wanggu continent. But evidently, this solution couldn't be quantized. Only people of extremely noble statuses could enjoy it. Ordinary cultivators could only hope for it but never obtain it. To the rogue cultivators at the lowest level of the social ladder and also the class with the most number, it was even more impossible for them to obtain it. The cultivation arts practiced by rogue cultivators usually had an extremely low degree of anomalous substances separation. In this case, not only was it difficult for them to cultivate, but their risk of mutation was also greater. However, despite the risk of cultivation being so great, the vast majority of people would still choose to become a cultivator. For example, Xu Qing knew that the current him could be considered a rogue cultivator. According to the records on the bamboo slip, the cultivators of the Ensoil were walking on a path of no return that was filled with difficulty and immense danger. They were akin to mortals swimming toward the other side of the deep sea, rushing toward the unreachable other shore. But no matter what, before they could even see the legendary other shore, they would have died of exhaustion. However, for Xu Qing, who had grown up in the slums, he deeply understood that every single conflict and illness could cause one to lose their life. So, rather than worrying about mutation in the future, I might as well be worried about my survival tomorrow, Xu Qing mumbled. He gingerly touched the wound on his chest as he stared at the sky outside the entrance gap. At this moment, dawn was about to arrive in the outside world. The howls and mournful cries also became fewer in number. If the blood rain still continues and I haven't found the purple light, I have to consider leaving this place to search for medicinal herbs in other cities. Xu Qing lowered his head and looked at the wound on his chest. Due to the god's aura permeating the atmosphere and the continued falling of the blood rain, almost every item in the city was heavily polluted. The medicinal herbs were naturally among them and this place was very lacking in terms of resources. Xu Qing lifted his hand and pressed down at the wound on his chest, causing some blood to seep out. His countenance was somewhat pale. He drew in a deep breath and removed his inner shirt, wrapping it around his body to use as a bandage for his wound. After that, he drummed himself mentally and silently waited for dawn. Not long later, the roars and mournful cries outside became scarcer. This lasted for a while before all sounds vanished completely. Through the entrance gap, Xu Qing could see that the sky outside was starting to become bright. Time was tight. According to his past experiences, he could already head out now. However, he didn't move immediately. Rather, he stood up to flex his somewhat stiff body first. Only after his body was warmed up did he remove the stones and miscellaneous items blocking the gap. He borrowed the aid from the faint light seeping in through the gap to open his leather pouch for a search. A dagger covered with rust was then taken out and tied to his thigh. That black-colored iron stick was placed in a location where he could grab it freely. There was also a snake head that was wrapped by him in sackcloth. He carefully opened it to do a check before cautiously keeping it. After he finished doing all this, Xu Qing closed his eyes for a few breaths before opening them again. His gaze was now replaced by a cold calmness. He rapidly squeezed his way out of the cave and paused for a moment outside the entrance. After vigilantly surveying his surroundings and ensuring that there were no troubles, Xu Qing rushed ferociously ahead. As the sky gradually brightened, he arrived in the outside world. He then sprinted ahead. Because the blood rain was still falling, the dense clouds completely covered the sky. Hence, even in daylight, one wouldn't even be able to see the sun, let alone have any chance to experience intense sunlight. Dawn and dusk were like an aged old man filled with age spots and were heavily ill. Hence, Xu Qing's cloudy gaze contained the frost of the night. Also, the breaths he exhaled transformed into the clear wind that was filled with the stench of death. It was very cold and very frosty. If Xu Qing didn't warm his body up earlier, he would involuntarily shiver once the wind gusted past him. But to Xu Qing, because his body still retained the warmth earlier, he wasn't too affected. Hence, his speed didn't reduce as he sped toward the area where he saw the seemingly alive man yesterday. If one stared at him from afar, in this spacious city, Xu Qing's figure was like a leopard, leaping across broken walls and sprinting smoothly forward with no hesitation. There were also a bunch of birds flying through the air that accompanied him. It was just that their altitude was very high, so it was tough to capture them. As he sprinted, Xu Qing lifted his head and stared at the soaring birds while licking his lips. He also had no idea why, but after the god opened its eyes, all life forms were tainted and almost everything died, including beasts. However, the bird species had the most survivors. Hence, these birds became the main solution for him to satisfy his hunger by hunting them during this period. At the same time, the birds were also trapped in the blood rain, but they seemingly could instinctively seek out a shelter with some modicum of safety. For example, the cave Xu Qing stayed in had been found by him by following the tracks of birds. This shelter also couldn't be considered completely safe, it was only safer comparatively. Also, it seemed easier for those mutated beasts and bizarre existences to neglect it. During this period, Xu Qing found two shelters. One was the stone cave and the other was a place outside the city lord's residence. Right now, he merely swept his gaze through the sky before retracting it. His eyes locked onto a certain area in the city as he moved closer and closer. Very soon, Xu Qing arrived at the area he saw yesterday. He didn't head over immediately but circled one round to look for a tall vantage point. After cautiously climbing up, he lay down unmoving as he squinted his eyes, trying not to reveal the light within as he slowly lowered his head to take a look. Xu Qing cast a gaze over and his pupils narrowed. Once again, he saw the person from yesterday. The other party was seated down with his back facing a wall. His clothes were tidy and his skin was normal. The most important thing was that his demeanor, his body, and everything about him were exactly the same as what he saw yesterday. It was like during the entire night, he didn't move or wasn't moved in any way at all. This was extremely illogical. If the person was a living human, he couldn't possibly ignore the dangers that emerged during the night. If the person was dead, his undamaged body would be the favorite food for mutated beasts. So it was impossible for his body to have remained untouched until now. Xu Qing fell silent. After pondering, he decided to remain unmoving. He, who grew up in the slums, didn't lack patience. Just like this, under his careful observation, time slowly flowed. Even when afternoon arrived, he still remained immobile. Xu Qing, who had waited for 6 hours, slowly lifted his right hand now. He held a stone in his hand and tossed it toward the location the other party was in. The speed of the stone was very quick and the impact wasn't small. When the stone hit the person, there was a loud bang. That figure trembled from the impact before falling down to the side like a corpse. And at the instant he fell down, a flicker of purple light flashed. The source of the light was on the ground where the person sat down previously. The moment he saw the purple glow, Xu Qing's eyes immediately gleamed as his breathing grew hurried. He had been searching for so many days for no other reason than the purple beam of light that had fallen into the city. At this moment, he forcibly suppressed his impulse to rush over immediately. He waited for some more moments with great difficulty and only rushed out rapidly after confirming that it was safe. His speed was extremely quick as he erupted forth with all his strength. His entire person was like a hunting eagle, directly heading to the location of the purple light. After swiftly rushing over, he grabbed the source of the purple light and retreated far away immediately with no hesitation. The entire process happened extremely quickly. Xu Qing only stopped and panted after he had retreated for over 10 zhongs. He then glanced at the item emitting purple light that was clutched in his hands. That was a shiny purple crystal that had a dazzling beauty. Xu Qing's heart pounded rapidly. When he tilted his head, he saw that the corpse that had fallen to the side was currently rotting rapidly after losing the purple light's protection. Its skin instantly turned greenish-black. This scene caused Xu Qing to instinctively tighten his grasp on the purple crystal in his hand. He then turned in the direction of his cave and rushed there speedily. Not long after he sprinted, Xu Qing suddenly paused. A puzzled look appeared on his face. He lowered his head and undid the button on his coat to glance at his bandaged wound. Right now, there was no longer blood seeping out. On the contrary, he felt waves of itchiness from the wound. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Sight only. Hence, Xu Qing's gaze turned heavy. He removed the inner shirt that he used as a bandage, and the moment he saw his wound, he felt an intense shock. He clearly remembered that when he checked this morning, his wound hadn't healed yet and the blackening had increased by a certain degree. But now, more than half of the wound on his chest had healed. Only a very thin scar remained at the sides of the wound. This, Xu Qing panted. After that, he fiercely stared at the purple crystal in his hand. The words Wangguin more liberal translation can mean staring at the past, gazing back at ancient times, etc. Outside of Time Chapter 5, I wish for you all to rest in peace. 1. Outside of time. This item. An intense gleam appeared in Xu Qing's eyes. The image of that perfectly undamaged corpse before he had taken the purple crystal away appeared in his mind. It can allow corpses to be undamaged and allow the living to heal quicker. Xu Qing grabbed the purple crystal as he surveyed the surroundings rapidly with an increased heart rate. Although he knew that there shouldn't be other people alive in this area, he was still instinctively vigilant due to obtaining a treasure. At this moment, he couldn't stay here anymore. He swiftly sped off back to the cave where he stayed earlier. On the journey back, he faintly discovered that not only did his injuries heal at a rapid pace, but even the physical fatigue he felt was much lesser. In the past when he sprinted like this, he would have to slow down roughly an hour later. But now, despite having sprinted for over an hour, he still felt that his body was warm and he had an abundance of stamina. In fact, on his way back, he even casually caught a bird that landed on the ground. He didn't kill the bird but knocked it unconscious instead because the preservation period for living things was longer. Even after doing these, the amount of time he used to reach the cave was much quicker than before. There was still some time before nightfall, but he already saw his cave in the nearby distance. Su Mo's mood was unprecedentedly good. However, he wasn't careless. Because he knew that maybe it was due to the god opening its eyes, or when the Forbidden Zone was initially formed, the nearby areas during the night would have other bizarre existences appearing other than the awakening of mutated beasts. When in the slums, he heard people saying that many places in the world where death gathered would eventually produce such bizarre existences. For example, the eerie laughter that rang out during the night from outside the cave was precisely from such an existence. With regards to such existences, everyone knew not to look, not to touch, and not to meet them. Although his past experiences told him that these existences only appeared at night, Xu Qing couldn't be sure whether they would occasionally appear during the day or not. Hence, he didn't reduce his speed in the slightest. He soon arrived at the cave and the moment he entered, he immediately blockaded the entrance. After that, he sat down cross-legged and opened his palm that was tightly clenched. The purple light spread from his palm, illuminating this tiny cave. Under the light, Xu Qing's eyes and face seemed to be dyed purple as well. He stared at the purple crystal in his hand unblinkingly. This crystal was rectangular shaped and roughly the size of his finger. There was some floccule in the crystal, and that was the source of the purple light. Healing wounds. Xu Qing observed for a long time. He then opened his shirt and glanced at the wound on his chest. He discovered that the wound was now 90% healed. Right now, the remaining wound seemed like it would heal completely after a short amount of time. In fact, even the scar at the edge of the wound was disappearing. He then thought back to his sprint and the feeling of being much less fatigued compared to the past. After that, Xu Qing roughly had an initial judgment of this purple crystal. The effect of this item was evidently recovery. It caused his wound and stamina to recover, including his vitality. I wonder if it has any other effects, Xu Qing mumbled as contemplation shone in his gaze. He didn't know whether this purple crystal had a connection with the act of the god opening its eyes, but most probably, there should be one. No matter what, this was a supreme treasure. At the very least, ever since Xu Qing was young until now, he had never heard of any items that possessed such shocking recovery prowess. By having such an item on him, the help it provided was equivalent to him having a second life. However, Xu Qing was very clear that he was able to possess this item only because there was no one alive other than him in this city. Once the blood rain ended and he exited this place, he most probably wouldn't have the strength to protect such a treasure. So, the only solution was to hide this purple crystal. Xu Qing fell silent for a long while. He cast a glance at the unconscious bird he had caught and lifted his hand to grab it over. After squeezing its beak to ensure it couldn't make any sound, he then took out the dagger on his thigh and directly sliced open a wound on the bird's body. As the bird struggled, Xu Qing stuffed the purple crystal inside it. After that, he observed it with meticulous attention. He saw that at the start, the bird was still struggling. But very soon, undercurrents surged from all directions. It was as though spirit energy was being drawn over. In fact, the amount of spirit energy was even more in comparison to what Xu Qing had gathered when he cultivated. The spirit energy then gushed into the bird's body. And right now, the intensity of the bird's struggle grew stronger by many times. Despite Xu Qing using his full strength, he felt that he actually could no longer control the bird so easily. This scene caused the light in Xu Qing's eyes to intensify. In the past, he could easily crush the neck of a bird with a gentle squeeze. But at this moment, he had to use the entirety of his strength to squeeze it several times before he managed to crush the bird's neck. He then swiftly took the purple crystal out and wiped it before closing his eyes to contemplate. The bird didn't die. On the contrary, spirit energy flooded its body and its strength suddenly became extremely great. There should be no worries. A moment later, Xu Qing opened his eyes. His eyes now gleamed with determination, and he directly stuffed the purple crystal into his wound that had yet to recover fully. The process of stuffing it inside was somewhat painful, but Xu Qing endured the pain by gritting his teeth. There was no place safer than hiding something inside the body. Also, he did a simple test and it seemed that this item would have better effects by placing it within his body. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Site only. As the purple crystal fused into his body and as his wound closed up, a rumbling sound echoed from within his body before Xu Qing could take a closer look. An even greater amount of spirit energy compared to what the bird had absorbed earlier began flooding forth directly from all directions, even seeping through the soil to reach him. The spirit energy was too shocking. Hence, Xu Qing's body instantly glowed with a faint blue color as an indescribable chill coursed through his entire body. This was due to the great amount of anomalous substances within the spirit energy. However, Xu Qing was long prepared. At this moment, he didn't hesitate to directly circulate his energy according to the mountains and seas art. Chapter 6, I wish for you all to rest in peace. 2. Outside of time. As he circulated his energy according to the mountains and seas art, the spirit energy flowing into his body suddenly filtered out a large amount of anomalous substances. After that, the cleansed spirit energy that remained coursed through his entire body through his energy channels, and this caused Xu Qing's body to emit popping noises at this moment. It was as though some previously congested areas in his body were now instantly opened. His blood and flesh were tempered and nourished at this moment. He visualized the Xiao image in his mind. At this moment, the Xiao seemed to come alive and was adopting all sorts of different postures. Although the mountains and seas art was known as a cultivation art, it didn't cultivate laws, but rather, it was a type of body refining method. There were a total of 10 levels that matched the 10 levels of the Qi condensation realm. The bamboo slip clearly introduced that every level a cultivator attained would grant them an additional tiger's worth of strength. 5 tigers made up 1 Xiao and 2 Xiaos made up 1 Kuei star. The introduction continued to say that Xiao could move mountains, while Kuei could shift seas. This was why the cultivation art was known as the mountains and seas art. At this moment, the purple crystal that was buried in his chest was like a vortex that continuously absorbed spirit energy, and it flowed toward the crystal with absurd ease. As a result, Xu Qing's cultivation speed greatly increased. After an unknown amount of time, the popping sounds in Xu Qing's body intensified and a lot of impurities within his body flowed out of the pores of his entire body. A pungent smell then permeated the cave. As the impurities flowed out, Xu Qing's body actually became more crystalline than before. Even his dirt-covered face looked more exquisite now. The popping sounds and the spirit energy flowing in gradually ceased after some time. After that, Xu Qing opened his eyes. A hint of purple light flashed past his eyes. After he recovered, Xu Qing's mind turned sluggish for a moment. Right now, the dark cave actually looked somewhat clearer in his eyes. He then hurriedly lowered his head to survey his body, and a look of disbelief gradually appeared on his face. This feeling, a trace of excitement flashed on Xu Qing's face. He stood up and punched out, actually creating the sharp gushing sound of wind from the blow. Because the cave was very small, he couldn't test his speed. But the feeling when he lifted his legs and punched out allowed him to know that there was a great improvement in all the various aspects of his body. After that, he immediately rolled up the sleeves on his left arm. When he saw a fingernail-sized black dot appearing there, Xu Qing drew in a deep breath and suppressed the excitement in his heart. So, this is the first level of Qi condensation. According to the description of the bamboo slip, this black dot was none other than a mutation point of someone who cultivated the mountains and seas art. It was located on their left arm. Moreover, there would be an additional black dot for every level the cultivator attained. He touched the mutation point on his arm. At this moment, Xu Qing was evidently excited with regard to his sudden improvement in strength. He then lifted his head and glanced at the entrance gap, waiting in anticipation for dawn so he could go out and test his speed. But very soon, Xu Qing's expression was filled with suspicion. He moved closer to the entrance gap and listened attentively. The outside world was as dark as ever, but there were no strange sounds at all. This was something he had never encountered despite his many days here. In the past, even if dawn had broken, although there were no more sounds from the mutated beasts and strange existences, the sound of falling rain would still exist. However, right now, even the sound of falling rain was gone. Can it be that? Xu Qing's mind was stirred as a conjecture rose in his heart. He silently waited until he saw a beam of resplendent light streaming through the entrance gap of the cave. The light reflected in Xu Qing's black pupils was as though it illuminated his entire world. The instant he saw the light, Xu Qing's body trembled. He lifted his hand and slowly approached the ray of light before he basked his body with it. He felt a warmth in his palm. This sensation, which he had not felt for a long time, slowly awakened his spirit that had been sleeping. Sunlight. A long time later, a bright luster appeared in Xu Qing's eyes, and he began to shift the blockage away. As more light streamed in, he slowly squeezed his way out of the gap. The instant he exited the cave, he lifted his head and what he saw was no longer the dense layer of dark clouds but the bright and resplendent sun. It was as though the old man in the morning suddenly regained his vitality after being ill for many days. The curtains of dark clouds finally parted, allowing freshness to descend upon the world again. The rain has stopped. Xu Qing took a deep breath of the air that contained the warmth of the sun as he silently gazed at the city under the shadow of the rising sun. Everything in the city seemed to shine with a different splendor under the resplendent red-tinged sky. The morning glow of the sky cascaded down from the gaps of the cloud. The rays of light were like countless whales spewing out golden waterfalls, cleansing away the darkness and mist in the city, revealing its mottled scars. The collapsed buildings everywhere, the numerous greenish-black corpses, the blood-colored puddles that constituted a shocking sight, everything seemed to be reminding Xu Qing that a calamity had happened here. A hint of complication appeared in Xu Qing's gaze. He had lived for 6 years in the slums outside the city, and he had also seen this city for 6 years. Although the number of times he entered was very few, this place was ultimately the place he had wanted to stay in the most for the past 6 years. I obtained a cultivation art here. I obtained the purple crystal here. I survived here. Xu Qing mumbled and fell silent. Only after a long time later did he sigh lightly and walk toward the greenish-black corpses. He lowered his head for some time and carried one of the corpses before he walked forward. He then headed to a public square nearby and placed the corpse down. After that, he turned and continued to carry the second corpse, the third, the fourth. Some of the corpses were at the end of the street, and some were even crushed underneath the rubble. Even so, he still carried all the corpses in the surrounding area to the public square. Right now, the corpses here were stacked up like a small mountain. Some were complete corpses, and others had parts of their bodies missing. Xu Qing stood there and started a fire. Maybe it was because of the anomalous substances. The flames grew increasingly intense the longer they burned, and thick smoke was soon emitted. Next to the thick smoke, Xu Qing gazed at the burning bodies for a very long time before he silently walked away to the second area. Very soon, another column of thick smoke spiraled upward, and the columns of thick smoke began to increase in number. Just like this, on the first day when the sunlight streamed into the city, other than the sunlight, there was only black smoke that arose from the burning corpses. The columns of black smoke rose to the skies, blotting out the sunlight. At this moment, the red morning glow was also filled with helplessness. The reddish hue darkened into a dark red, and it felt as though the sky was sighing. It also seemed that the columns of smoke had become the tears, and the shadow cast by the smoke on the ground transformed into tear stains. The last tear stain was at the location Xu Qing discovered the purple light. Over there, Xu Qing placed the corpse of the old man from the medical shop down. As he burned the body, heat waves gushed forth and he stood silently at the side. The roiling flames were reflected in his dark pupils as they flickered unceasingly. His disheveled and dried long hair also slowly curled from the heat. A long time later, Xu Qing's body bent as he lowered his head to pray. I wish for you all to rest in peace. At this moment, the flames suddenly flared intensely and the heat grew increasingly stronger. Sparks akin to dandelion seeds were generated, and they floated in the sky along with the wind. Only the spiraling smoke still contained reluctance and regret that was impossible to diffuse. Even the wind couldn't disperse the emotions. As the smoke rose higher, it felt like wounds had appeared in the sky. They were insignificant and filled with helplessness. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Site only. A long time later, as the sounds of chaotic steps rang out, a strange voice drifted over behind the youth. I was saying why we didn't see any corpses when we were on our way here. So, there's a silly brat who didn't mind wasting his strength and stamina to cremate these corpses. Might as well. Since your longing cannot be cut, I shall help you and toss you inside the fire to let you accompany them. Xu Qing then abruptly turned his body to face these people. One supernatural being from Chinese Folklore's Chapter 7, Uninvited Guest, 1. Outside of time. The instant Xu Qing turned, he quickly observed the situation behind him. He saw that 7 to 8 jongs asterisk away, there were 7 people in different locations moving closer to him. There were adults, males, and females in this group of 7. They mainly wore deep gray leather coats, and they had many leather pouches attached to their waists. All of them possessed weapons as well, and they spread themselves out in different directions. 3 of them had bows and 2 wielded blades, but none of them showed their backs to each other. It was as though they were wary for some reason. There was also another person who wore boxing gloves. He moved forward alone, standing in the centermost location. As for the person who had spoken in an eccentric way earlier, he was a tall and muscular dude. This man carried a gigantic axe, and his distance was the closest to Xu Qing. He had a sturdy frame, a full beard, and a malevolent-looking scar on his face. At this moment, his gaze shone with cruelty as he smiled maliciously while striding forward with huge steps toward Xu Qing. All of these were seen by Xu Qing in a single glance. His pupils narrowed as his mind instantly analyzed the fact that these people weren't a single entity. Rather, it seemed that they had grouped up on the spur of the moment. He could tell this from the locations they stood in and the wariness they exhibited toward the others. Besides, Xu Qing had guessed these people's identities. They were all scavengers. The Nanhuang continent didn't lack scavengers. The majority of them were cruel and didn't have any bottom lines. Everything was a case of the strong eating the weak. Evidently, now that the blood rain had stopped in the forbidden zone and the boundary had opened, the scavengers in the surroundings were all drawn here. To them, although the forbidden zone was dangerous, their lives were already balanced on the edge of a blade. Hence, the resources contained in an empty city were enough to make their eyes red with envy. Even if some items were tainted, they would still have some storage value. As Xu Qing's thoughts rapidly flitted across his mind, his body moved as he was about to leap to the side. However, that burly dude who was moving closer to him immediately rushed forward when he saw that Xu Qing wanted to flee. The cruelty in his eyes intensified, and his malevolent smile contained a hint of bloodthirst. Wanting to flee? I love abusing and killing brats like you the most. You should have plenty of items in your leather pouch, right? Captain Lei, let me handle this kid. The burly dude's eyes flashed with cruelty. It felt like the cruelty within his eyes shot out and transformed into intimidation. Combining that with his tall, muscular figure and his battle axe, the sense of oppression he exuded was exceedingly strong. At this moment, he rushed forward with large strides and leaped in the direction Xu Qing was in before tossing his battle axe over. With a whooshing sound, the battle axe whistled through the air and closed the distance between them, instantly approaching its target from the air. The muscular dude had great strength and his movements weren't slow either. However, Xu Qing's speed was even quicker. At that instant the battle axe arrived, his body had fiercely sped up as he dodged to the side. The battle axe harmlessly whistled past the area in front of him. However, the wind from the momentum blasted into Xu Qing's face, causing his disheveled hair to flutter a little, revealing his cold wolf-like gaze underneath his hair. At the next moment, Xu Qing's body borrowed the momentum of his dodge to roll onto the ground. However, he didn't choose to flee. Rather, he moved closer to the burly dude and lifted his right hand while a raven black-colored iron stick directly appeared in it. Borrowing the advantage that his height was shorter than the other party, Xu Qing furiously leaped, and the iron stick in his hand stabbed upward from down below, aiming to pierce the burly dude's chin. Everything happened too quickly. The skinny body of Xu Qing as well as his earlier act of fleeing was all to naturally mask his intention to attack. As for the burly dude, he also felt a sense of life and death crisis at this instant. After all, he was extremely experienced. At this moment, his upper body furiously leaned backward and his countenance drastically changed. He narrowly avoided the iron stick, but the iron stick still caused a wound on his chin. However, before he could fester the anger in his heart, Xu Qing swiftly pulled out the dagger from his thigh with his left hand, looking extremely cold. At the moment the upper body of the burly dude leaned back, Xu Qing directly stabbed the dagger into the instep of the burly dude's right foot. A plopping sound then echoed out as the dagger penetrated the straw sandals and the flesh, directly pinning the burly dude's foot into the soil. As a result, the expression of the burly dude contorted, and intense pain swept through his entire body. A tragic cry abruptly rang out. He was then about to counterattack, but Xu Qing was too nimble. After Xu Qing attacked, his body instantly shot toward a broken bunker for cover. He crouched there and was ready to attack again. When the flickering flames illuminated his face, it made his entire person look a little indistinct. His wolf-like gaze was something the flickering flame couldn't conceal. It was filled with wariness and ruthlessness as he stared at the scavengers. All of these happened too quickly. Xu Qing's young age and skinny body frame confused many of the scavengers, causing them to be careless. Hence, they didn't manage to react immediately. At this moment, a fierce glint flashed in the eyes of everyone. Particularly, the gazes of the three people with the bows turned even sharper. Xu Qing, who was hiding behind the bunker, didn't bother to glance at the burly dude not far away who was screaming tragically, struggling to pull out the dagger from his insole. His gaze swept through the three archers and eventually landed on the man with the boxing gloves in the center. This man was an old man. Although his clothing was similar to the others, his gaze was the sharpest. Also, Xu Qing could sense the hidden undercurrents of spirit energy from his body. From the old man's position as well as the way the gazes of others instinctively gathered on the old man, Xu Qing had a guess in his heart. This old man probably was the temporary leader of these scavengers. Xu Qing looked at the old man and analyzed, while the old man also looked at him. There seemed to be a hint of strangeness in his gaze. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Site only. Very soon, the old man shifted his eyes away. He only looked at the burning flames not far away and remained silent. At this moment, the burly dude who had removed the dagger had flames of anger in his eyes. He let out a loud roar and was about to rush at Xu Qing. Brat, watch how I make you die. Xu Qing narrowed his eyes, which were gleaming with sharpness. Just when he was about to act, an aged voice calmly rang out at this moment. 11 Zhang equals 3.3333 meters. Chapter 8, Uninvited Guest, 2. Outside of time. Enough. This single word was filled with intimidation, causing the burly dude who was roaring to halt his steps. He then turned his head toward the speaker. The person who had spoken was none other than the old man wearing boxing gloves whom Xu Qing had seen earlier. Captain Lei. That kid should be a lucky survivor from the slums outside. Since the gods have spared him, you shouldn't act against him. Let us leave. But, a strong reluctance could be seen in the eyes of the burly dude. He believed he was just careless earlier. If he really acted seriously, he was confident he could crush Xu Qing's neck in the span of a few breaths of time. Just when he was about to speak, the old man calmly glanced at him. Do you need me to repeat myself? The burly dude's expression showed a struggle, but he ultimately lowered his head. It was just that when he lowered his head, he glanced at Xu Qing, who was hiding in the bunker, from the corner of his eyes, and killing intent flashed in his expression. After that, his countenance turned gloomy as he turned and limped in the old man's direction. Xu Qing sensed the killing intent. His eyes narrowed slightly as he warily gazed at this group of scavengers who were walking further away. However, just when they moved tens of zhang away, the old man in the center suddenly stopped. He turned his head, and it was unknown whether he was looking at Xu Qing or the flames from the pile of burning corpses as he suddenly spoke a long time later. "Kid, are you willing to leave here with me?" Xu Qing started. He noticed the other party's tone. The old man said me and not us. Hence, Xu Qing fell silent as his gaze swept through the crowd. The old man was also someone with patience, so he didn't rush Xu Qing. He stood far away and waited for Xu Qing's answer. Tens of breaths later, Xu Qing once again swept his gaze through these people. He then looked at the old man as well as the gloomy burly dude whom he injured. A strange light flashed in the youth's eyes. He slowly stood up and didn't speak, moving nearer to them. Upon seeing Xu Qing walking over, the old man smiled and turned to continue walking. The others also cast deep looks at Xu Qing as they departed together. Just like this, Xu Qing followed this group of scavengers and watched them search through and collect all the valuable items in the city. In the meantime, he also learned that the nickname of the burly dude was Broken Ox. This person had swept his sinister gaze many times towards Xu Qing. However, he was evidently suppressing his murderous urge. It seemed like he wasn't anxious and wanted to wait for a chance to act when the old man wasn't present. Also, it was like he was very sure that there would be such an opportunity appearing on their journey. Xu Qing contemplated for a while and thought of the burly dude's greed before coming up with a plan. Hence, with his familiarity with the city, he provided some aid to these scavengers. Xu Qing assumed a very humble demeanor and helped these scavengers to find more valuable items at an even quicker speed. As for Broken Ox, his greed was clear to all. Even though the load he was carrying was full and the weight had exceeded what he could bear, he still wanted to grab more items. Hence, he who was already injured searched more places than others and also carried an increased load due to having more items. At the start, this couldn't count for much. But as time flowed, the stamina of the burly dude was greatly exhausted. The sense of fatigue he felt also soon exceeded the others. As for the area around the city lord's residence, Xu Qing thought of how the old man named Captain Lei had helped him. So, he decided not to lure them over. They continued doing this until the night was about to descend. The group then finally left the city and set up a campsite in the slums outside the city. Their actions were very proficient, and they soon set up 6 tents. Other than the 2 people wielding blades sharing a single tent, the others were all solo. They lit up a stick of incense outside their tents, and some even took out some powder and sprinkled it in the surroundings. Seeing that the sky was growing darker and the various roars in the city started echoing out, these scavengers all entered their tents. Only Captain Lei swept his gaze toward the lonely Xu Qing. He took out a sleeping bag and tossed it over to him. Lighting the incense can dispel the mutated beasts, and the powder can stop the bizarre existences from coming nearer. Given your contribution today, Broken Ox won't dare to target you when I'm here. This place can still be considered safe. After the old man finished speaking, he no longer cared and entered his tent. Xu Qing didn't speak. He merely cast a deep glance at the old man's tent before opening the sleeping bag and snuggling inside. However, he didn't seal it completely, leaving a slight gap facing the direction of the scavenger's tent. During late night, the roars and mournful cries outside grew even more intense, and an eerie crying sound also reverberated through the air. The terrifying atmosphere seemed to be inundated everywhere in the outside world. No one was willing to leave the safety of their current dwelling place, except Xu Qing. In the sleeping bag, he opened his eyes and remained immobile as he silently waited. Time continued to flow, and when it was deep in the night, when most people were soundly sleeping, Xu Qing slowly climbed out of his sleeping bag. His movements were very careful and he did his best not to make any sound. The roars and mournful cries inside the city echoed in his ears, but they didn't cause him the slightest bit of distraction. After Xu Qing climbed out carefully, he silently walked toward the tent that the burly dude nicknamed Broken Ox was in. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Site only. He wouldn't allow a concealed danger near him that would threaten his life to exist. Even though it was a concealed danger, he had to think of a solution to resolve it immediately. This was a rule Xu Qing had learned by surviving in the slums through lessons paid in blood. This was the true reason why he had agreed to follow the old man. In fact, all the help he provided these scavengers during the day to allow them to have a greater harvest was because he saw Broken Ox's greed. He wanted the injured Broken Ox to be even more fatigued and lose his wariness. Hence, he intentionally adopted a humble demeanor to numb the other party, to make him unprepared. All of this was for the sake of taking action right now. Currently, Xu Qing's expression was calm as he softly approached the tent. He wasn't reckless at all. He first squatted there to listen attentively for a long while. Chapter 9, Uninvited Guest, 3. Outside of time. The breathing sounds that entered his ear had a regular rhythm and it didn't seem fake. After confirming this, Xu Qing narrowed his eyes and slowly took out his iron stick. He then softly opened the zip to the tent and slowly entered. The interior of the tent was dim, and Xu Qing could faintly see Broken Ox lying there. He was in a very deep sleep. Clearly, his exertions in the day, in addition to being injured, caused him to be incomparably fatigued. Besides, his mentality was that of an expert, and this caused Broken Ox to be unable to imagine in his wildest dreams that the cooperative youth during the day would dare to take the risk to enter his tent when all the other scavengers were present. So at this moment, he had no idea that there was an uninvited guest in his tent. Xu Qing stared at Broken Ox, who was in a deep sleep. His cold gaze was as calm as the deep seas as he approached softly. When he finally arrived beside his target, Xu Qing didn't hesitate. The dagger in his right hand glinted with cold light as he sliced the neck of the utterly ignorant Broken Ox ruthlessly. His strength was exceedingly great and the head of his target was almost cleanly separated from its body. Fresh blood instantly gushed forth. The intense pain caused the eyes of Broken Ox to snap open. When he saw Xu Qing's emotionless face, his expression became one of disbelief and dread. Just as he wanted to struggle, Xu Qing's left hand rapidly lifted and pressed down on his mouth, causing him to be unable to utter a single sound. His struggle grew increasingly intense. Broken Ox's eyes were wide open as his entire body twitched madly. However, Xu Qing's arm was as though it was made of steel, pressing down on his target with a strength death would envy. He also lifted his right leg and directly stomped on Broken Ox's stomach. Xu Qing's body adopted the posture of a bow, and he borrowed the stance to stabilize his strength, causing Broken Ox's struggle to be futile. As blood continued gushing forth, Broken Ox was like a fish that was out of the water. Slowly, the look of despair flared intensely in his gaze, there was even a pleading expression. However, what he saw was still Xu Qing's calm face. As for the sounds his body produced during the struggle, it was completely masked under the roars and mournful cries of the outside world. Time slowly flowed and tens of breaths later, Broken Ox's struggles grew gradually weaker. Finally, his body trembled and completely relaxed into an immobile state. Only his eyes, which were still open, showed the terror and anger he felt before his death. Xu Qing didn't release his grab immediately. He waited for a while more to confirm that the other party had really died before he released his hands. After wiping away the blood on his hands, he opened his leather pouch. He then cautiously took out the snake head wrapped in a sackcloth and carefully used the poisonous fangs of the snake head to pierce Broken Ox's skin. At the next instant, as the poison spread, green bubbles were generated from Broken Ox's corpse, and it slowly melted. After the amount of time it took for an incense stick to burn out, the corpse completely dissolved into a puddle of blood that seeped into the mud. Xu Qing silently watched everything. After that, he started to clean the scene up and cleared all of Broken Ox's belongings, creating an illusion that the other party had gone missing. Only then did he leave the tent. The cold wind blew at his face, blowing some of the smell of blood that lingered on his body away. Xu Qing lifted his head and looked at the dark night. After that, he took a deep breath of cold air before slowly walking back to his sleeping bag. The moment he lay down in the sleeping bag, his heart state finally felt more solid. This was the sense of safety generated from removing the concealed danger, and it allowed him to close his eyes in peace and fall asleep. However, he still held the iron stick in his hand securely, his grip wasn't relaxed at all. The night was silent. On the next morning, when rays of the sun streamed down and illuminated the land, Xu Qing opened his eyes. He then quietly climbed out of his sleeping bag and casually glanced in the direction of Broken Ox's tent. At the next instant, his eyes narrowed slightly. Broken Ox's tent had actually vanished. Hence, Xu Qing's heart sank as he grew even warier. Very soon, the other scavengers continuously exited their tents in the early morning and discovered this matter. All of them felt puzzled and some began searching the surroundings for clues. However, because Broken Ox had vanished thoroughly and his tent also disappeared, everyone eventually came to the conclusion that Broken Ox had left halfway through the night due to his greed for the items in the city, or he left for some other reasons that he didn't want to make public. In any case, in this forbidden zone, there were too many reasons why one would disappear. This group was originally a team that was formed temporarily. Moreover, Broken Ox was a loner, so a short time later, these scavengers no longer cared about this matter. Some of them glanced at Xu Qing, but somehow, they felt that it was impossible for this matter to have a connection with him. Besides, they had no obligation to investigate, so they retracted all their conjectures. Only the old man known as Captain Lei shot a glance filled with deep meaning at Xu Qing when he took Xu Qing's sleeping bag back. He then calmly spoke. "Now, are you still willing to leave with me?" This sentence was inundated with many meanings, so Xu Qing fell silent. The old man didn't say anything more. He then called out to everyone to hurry since there was light from the sun. Qing Su stood dumbfoundedly for a moment at his original location. He instinctively turned his head to look at the ruined city. Ultimately, he turned back to stare at the back view of the old man. After thinking for a moment, he strode forward and his footsteps gradually grew more determined. 6 scavengers and a kid. Their shadows under the sunlight were lengthened. Far away, the wind gusted, blowing away their sighs and rueful emotions as they continued with their journey. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Site only. This is a calamity of the gods. The entire city was annihilated. There's one more forbidden zone in this world. This cannot be counted as anything much. Have you guys heard about this story before? About 7 to 8 years ago, there was a major city in the northern region. The god opened its eyes and glanced over there. After that, that area, including the city, directly vanished in a bizarre manner. It was as though they had never existed before. The sound of conversation grew weaker and weaker. Under the sunlight, together with the figures trekking on a long journey, the youth remained silent. He quietly listened and continued to walk further and further into the distance. Chapter 10, Scavenger's Campsite. Outside of time. The forbidden zone formed in this part of the eastern region of the Nanhuang continent wasn't very big. The ruins that Xu Qing's group had left were at the edges of the forbidden zone. This was also why the scavengers were able to rush over to the city on the first day the sunlight came. Therefore, when the sky was gradually turning dark, they were almost out of the forbidden zone's perimeters. They had encountered some mutated beasts on the way, but the beasts were quickly taken care of by these scavengers. Xu Qing came to an assessment after observing them. He felt that if he were to make a move, amongst the 6 scavengers, he would have a chance against any of them other than Captain Lei. They aren't cultivators, but the viciousness when they fought, their grasp of timing, as well as their indifferent attitude toward death in critical moments allowed their killing prowess to be enhanced. Xu Qing assessed these people and analyzed the situation. He reckoned that he could fight against any one of them in a one-on-one battle, other than Captain Lei. In fact, it might not be impossible for him to take on 2 of them at once. But he probably couldn't handle 3 in one go. Xu Qing became increasingly cautious after he made this judgment. At the same time, he was also sharp enough to notice that as the distance from the external world grew closer, those scavengers' expressions became a lot more relaxed. They even started to chat and joke with each other on the way. Only the old man who was called Captain Lei didn't say a word along the way. The others treated the old man with a lot of respect, and this made Xu Qing feel a little curious about his identity. However, this curiosity didn't reduce his wariness. Even though they were almost out of the forbidden zone, Xu Qing continued to be on his guard. So, even when he was following these scavengers, he didn't get close to them completely. Instead, he kept a suitable distance and followed cautiously as he listened to them talking. When the sky was almost completely dark, Xu Qing paused in his footsteps as a sensation of warmth gushed over him. He then turned and stared at the desolate land behind him, before looking at the world in front of him. Between heaven and earth, the place he was standing in seemed to have an invisible boundary. Within the boundary was a rudimentary forbidden zone that had just been formed. It was extremely cold. Outside the boundary was the normal world that was filled with vitality and warmth. They finally walked out of the forbidden zone. Although it was nighttime outside, the starry sky was dazzling and the bright moon hung high up in the sky. Although the land outside also reeked of desolation, it was a far cry from the coldness in the forbidden zone. There'd also be occasional cries from ordinary birds and beasts. Xu Qing even saw a rabbit in the bushes far away, and it was looking at them warily. Everything here made Xu Qing feel a little in a daze. At this moment, those scavengers' expressions became completely relaxed. Even Captain Lei's brows were no longer knitted. We're finally out. This trip is considered quite smooth. If it's possible, I wouldn't want to take another step into the forbidden zones. Don't go to the forbidden zones? If you want to survive in this damned world, if you want to live a better life, you must risk your life in the forbidden zones. Sooner or later, I'll buy a residency right in a 7 Blood Eyes branch city. Now that they were out of the forbidden zone, these scavengers were clearly in a more relaxed mood and kept chatting with each other. Xu Qing kept quiet but listened attentively. From the conversations he had heard on the way, he had gained a lot of information that he wouldn't have heard of in the past. Take the 7 Blood Eyes for example. He had heard these scavengers mention them many times. They seemed to be a very powerful influence. Also, the name Purple Earth had been mentioned by them many times. You only have such a small ambition? There are many 7 Blood Eyes branch cities. Antler City, which is nearby, is one of them. However, the qualifications there can't be bought with just spirit coins. You still need the recommendation of a 7 Blood Eyes' disciple. Residency rights? My goal is to obtain the qualifications to enter the 7 Blood Eyes and become a 7 Blood Eyes' disciple. If you go to the 7 Blood Eyes, you won't be able to survive for more than 3 days. Who doesn't know how to boast? Why don't you say that your goal is to head to the Wanggu continent overseas? The place of origin for the human race can be found there. When Xu Qing heard this, his heart skipped a beat. He had seen the name Wanggu on the bamboo slip. Wanggu? You think that I wouldn't go if I had the capability to ignore those forbidden creatures in the sea? 2 of the scavengers seemed to have some verbal conflict and started arguing. As Xu Qing perked his ears and was about to continue to listen to their conversation to obtain more information, the old man named Captain Lei threw a glance at them. He then spoke for the first time on the journey. It's not impossible if you want to go to the Wanggu continent. There are 4 ways to do so, and you guys can give it some thought to see which method is suitable for you. Firstly, achieve foundation building by the age of 15 years old, becoming a rarely seen heaven chosen. Secondly, pay 300,000 June asterisk worth of spirit coins and purchase a migration quota from Purple Earth, 7 Blood Eyes, or the Litusect Star. Thirdly, make an outstanding contribution in alchemy for the human race. Fourthly, be taken in as a personal disciple by one of the great clans from Purple Earth, or by one of the 7 Blood Eyes' peak lords asterisk, or the Litusect sect master. Oh, there's a 5th way, which is to become a treasure nurturer. Think about it. Which method is suitable for you? All the scavengers fell silent, especially when they heard the 5th method. Their expressions became very unnatural and their gazes revealed horror. Xu Qing focused his gaze. He had heard of the term treasure nurturers before. Back when he was in the slums, he had a few close companions with him who were taken away by some people dressed in luxurious clothes. It was said that they wanted to nurture them into treasure nurturers. Back then, the other children in the slums were very envious. Therefore, he hesitated a moment before looking at Captain Lei and asking softly, "May I ask, what are treasure nurturers?" Captain Lei's gaze landed on Xu Qing and he slowly spoke. Using one's body to nourish magic treasure and cultivate unique techniques, using one's flesh and blood to dilute the anomalous substances in magic treasures. This will help to ease the anomalous substances increment with each use of the magic treasure. While it allows the continuous usage of the magic treasures, the treasure nurturers' bodies will gradually wear out and they'll die. Xu Qing's eyes narrowed and he fell silent for a long while. Everyone seemed to have lost interest in chatting because of the words treasure nurturers. They then continued to walk silently in the dark night. It was until they had left a distance away from the Forbidden Zone and arrived at a stretch of plains that Captain Lei chose to set up camp. Unlike how they had done things in the Forbidden Zone, when they set up camp in the external world, they not only set up tents but also started a campfire. As the flames burned, the warmth grew stronger. These scavengers then sat around the campfire, each taking out their food to roast. Fragrance gradually permeated the air out as they cooked. Xu Qing gulped when he saw their food. Meanwhile, he sat in the far distance and took out half a piece of tough meat jerky, putting it into his mouth and chewing it off with great effort. Captain Lei, who was next to the campfire, looked over. He then got up and went over to where Xu Qing was. As Xu Qing abruptly raised his head, Captain Lei tossed over a leather pouch. There were a few hot buns within. Xu Qing's eyes widened the instant he saw these buns. He held in his urge and spoke up in a low voice. "Thank you." Captain Lei didn't say anything and returned to the side of the campfire. A scavenger next to him laughed and asked, "Captain Lei, why are you treating this kid so well? We're all pitiful people. Since we met each other, we are fated. If I can help, then I'll help a little." There were 3 buns in the bag and they felt very warm to the touch. Xu Qing hesitated for a moment. He saw that everyone next to the campfire was also eating the same buns. Therefore, he first pretended to take a bite while he continued to observe those scavengers. After noticing that they were all fine after a while, he continued to hold his impulse in for a very long time before he finally took a small bite, keeping the food in his mouth and waiting for a moment. Only after ascertaining that it was fine did he slowly chew it thoroughly and swallow it slowly. And after another long period of waiting and confirming again that it was fine, he completely relaxed and heaved a sigh of relief in his heart. He couldn't hold it in anymore and finished one of the buns in big bites. Then, he hesitated for a moment and finished the second one as well. Although he was still hungry, he still wrapped up the last bun and carefully placed it in his leather pouch, as if he was storing a precious treasure. As it quickly got later into the night, the scavengers returned to their tents in succession. After that, Captain Lei acted the same as yesterday and passed a sleeping bag to Xu Qing. He then said a sentence before he left. "This is a gift for you." Xu Qing raised his head and looked at Captain Lei before he suddenly spoke. "Why? What do you mean why? Are you talking about the 3 buns and 1 sleeping bag? There's no reason for that. If you feel grateful, just get me some food in the future." Captain Lei turned and headed toward his tent. "What do you like to eat?" "Me." Captain Lei stood next to his tent and thought about it. "Snakes. Those things don't taste bad." After saying that, he entered his tent. Xu Qing held on to the sleeping bag and looked at Captain Lei's tent for a very long time. He then nodded heavily in agreement before entering the sleeping bag and closing his eyes. However, he didn't fall asleep immediately. Instead, he quietly circulated the mountains and seas art with his eyes closed. This had already become a habit of his. Even though it felt extremely chilly when cultivating, he didn't give up at all. He made use of all the time he had to work hard in his cultivation. This was especially so after Captain Lei had mentioned the point of achieving foundation building before the age of 15. Although he couldn't compare with those heaven chosens mentioned in books, he still had some hope. "I'm 14 this year," Xu Qing mumbled and then continued cultivating. Just like that, time slowly ticked on and very soon, 5 days passed. Xu Qing followed these scavengers to cross over mountains and travel across plains. 3 people had left midway through the journey. This also verified Xu Qing's assessment previously that these people had grouped together on a temporary basis. By the 7th day, after the 2 blade-wielding scavengers left as well, only Xu Qing and Captain Lei remained. On this night, at the foot of a mountain, Captain Lei looked at Xu Qing. The latter took small bites of a bun next to the campfire while keeping some of the buns for later. After that, Captain Lei slowly spoke. "Kid, we'll be able to reach our destination tomorrow at noon. That's the place I live at and it is also a campsite where scavengers gather." Xu Qing looked up at the old man. The old man gazed into the far distance and continued speaking. Scavenger campsites tend to be set up next to forbidden zones. Therefore, the area on that side of the mountain next to the campsite is also a forbidden zone. Compared to the rudimentary forbidden zone you were in previously, this one has existed for a very long time. Not only do ferocious beasts exist there, but there are also dangerous places, and the density of anomalous substances is extremely high. If an ordinary person doesn't come out from there after 1 day, they'll definitely die. Even I can only hang on for 7 days at most there. However, that place produces 7-leaf grass in abundance. It is a necessary ingredient in refining white pills. White pills are the foundational alchemy pills that cultivators use to neutralize the anomalous substances in their bodies. Therefore, many outsiders come to this place. They care for their lives and aren't familiar with the terrain, so they rarely go pick the 7-leaf grass themselves. They usually tend to spend spirit coins to get the native scavengers to enter the forbidden zone and pick the grass. After saying this, the old man looked at Xu Qing. Do you understand what I mean? You're saying that the native scavengers in the campsite are people who can do anything for the sake of money. When Xu Qing heard about the white pill and its effects, he squinted his eyes and said this after some thought. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Site only. Captain Lei's gaze had a hint of surprise and he smiled. Your answer is partially correct. What I want to tell you is that the rule in scavenger campsites is simply the survival of the fittest. Strength is above everything else. However, it is still a place of residency at least. Moreover, it has a marketplace where one can purchase or sell living necessities. There'd even be merchant groups who would come occasionally. Therefore, the housing at the campsite is quite valuable. As such, not everyone can enter as they please. For an unfamiliar face to gain residency rights, they must go through a beast fight. This was a rule decided by the camp leader. And if you pass it successfully, I can allow you to stay at my place for a fee, said the old man slowly as he looked at Xu Qing. Chapter 11, Kid. Outside of time, the Nanhuang continent was very vast. If one gazed down from above, one could see that the Nanhuang continent looked like an irregular oval-shaped chessboard that was surrounded by seas. It was separated by a boundless sea from the Wanggu continent and appeared more like an island. However, its area was very vast, and many people wouldn't be able to finish traversing it even if they used their entire life. It was just that the vast majority of the places there were difficult for the human race to enter. They were separated by the Truth Mountain range that ran obliquely through the entire Nanhuang continent. Moreover, there was an extremely vast forbidden zone in the southwest region of the Truth Mountain range. That place occupied almost 70% of the Nanhuang continent. Hence, only the northeast region of the Truth Mountain range had suitable places for the human race to stay in. But even so, the population of humans here wasn't small. In the northeast region, the minor and major cities were as densely packed as stars in the sky. There were sturdy ones and simple ones. However, these cities were all built while avoiding the small-scaled forbidden zones that could be seen everywhere in the northeast region. If there was a choice, no one would be willing to live in the surroundings of a forbidden zone. Staying there meant that one would constantly be in danger. Only outlaws would gather near there as a last resort. Their eyes were red with jealousy as they licked the edge of their blades while struggling to survive. Hence, scavenger camps were formed. In the surroundings of almost every forbidden zone, there would be such a campsite. From the perspective of the entire human race's territory, the location of the scavenger camps was very mixed. At this moment, such a campsite was perfectly reflected in Xu Qing's eyes as he stood on a mountain peak. By staring from afar, the campsite wasn't considered very large. There were merely several hundreds of people living there. Maybe it was due to the time being in the early morning. The smoke that arose from cooking was thick. Although this place wasn't as prosperous as a city, it was still very lively. There were sounds of shouting, insults, peddlers' trade, and even unbridled laughter mixing together. These sounds were then transmitted to a very far distance. For the valuable housing Captain Lei had been talking about, Xu Qing could see that ranging from the inner part of the campsite to the outer part, the structure of the houses grew increasingly simpler. The houses at the external perimeter were basically tents. And at a distance not far away behind the campsite, there was a pitch-black jungle. That place was shrouded by mist as though it was hiding some terrifying existence. Even if the sky was filled with bright sunlight, the rays of the sun had no way to shine through there. It was as though there were gods and devils within, and they exuded cold intimidation in all directions. It looked like the black-colored mutation spots on the human body. It was a shocking sight and at the same time, it was isolated from the other parts as well. How do you feel after seeing it? On the mountain peak, Captain Lei asked. It's about the same as the slums. Xu Qing thought about it before answering honestly. Captain Lei smiled and didn't reply. He then continued to walk forward. Xu Qing retracted his gaze and followed behind Captain Lei. The two of them descended the mountain, and their distance to the campsite got nearer and nearer. On their way there, they encountered people in small teams of 2s and 3s who had exited or entered the campsite. Their clothes were all similar, and they mainly wore leather coats of a deep gray color. Xu Qing noticed that after these people saw Captain Lei, they all revealed looks of reverence on their faces. The majority of their gazes also contained curiosity as they glanced at Xu Qing. This made Xu Qing have even more guesses about Captain Lei's identity. Just like this, when the sun was high in the sky, Xu Qing followed Captain Lei and entered the plains underneath the mountain. They then got to the scavenger campsite. The campsite had no walls and the layout was very chaotic. Clouds of dust, withered leaves, and garbage could be seen everywhere, and there was a feeling of smog and miasma. As Xu Qing went deeper, the sounds he heard from the mountain also grew clearer as they entered Xu Qing's ears. What then entered his vision were numerous simple-looking buildings and a multitude of scavengers. Some were like broken ox, muscular and incomparably sturdy, but there were also skinny scavengers who had sinister and venomous gazes. A portion of them were old people who were so advanced in age that they could barely open their eyes, yet no one dared to antagonize them. Other than them, Xu Qing could see youths like him cowering in a corner and listlessly staring at the sky. A portion of them were cripples. All in all, there were plenty of people here. After Xu Qing saw them, his eyes narrowed slightly. He could sense spirit energy fluctuations from their auras. There were people of all shapes and sizes. Some were trading, some were sparring, and some were lying on large rocks and basking in the sun. Some had just hoisted their pants up as they walked out of the tents with brightly colored feathers on top. Their expressions were one of lust being satisfied. Xu Qing followed Captain Lei into the camp. From the perspective of an outsider, it was like walking into hell. However, other than the vigilance in his heart, he didn't wear any strange expression. In fact, he even felt a faint familiarity. Indeed, it resembles the slums a lot. Xu Qing mused in his heart. His gaze swept past those tents with feathers hanging on them, and he saw the scantily clad figures within. In fact, in one of the tents, a young woman even walked out half naked. She had a lazy expression on her face as she smiled and waved her hands at Xu Qing. Don't look randomly. Captain Lei swept his gaze at Xu Qing. I know what sort of place that is, answered Xu Qing as he retracted his gaze. The wrinkles on Captain Lei's face squeezed together into a half smile. He didn't say anything and continued to lead Xu Qing to the campsite until he arrived at his destination. That place was a gigantic building constructed from wood at the center of the camp. It was ring-shaped and appeared to be a coliseum for fighting beasts. On the way here, Xu Qing had been observing. In his mind, half of the map of this campsite had already formed. This was his habit. Many times, familiarity with the surroundings could become an advantage to aid one in resolving a crisis. At this moment, he lifted his head and looked at the coliseum-like building. He noticed that other than the gigantic field in the center, there were many crudely built tall chairs arranged around the field. Other than this, waves of roars from ferocious beasts could be heard from within the building. There were also rows of wooden sheds in the surroundings of the building. A few scavengers with clean clothes were faintly smiling and chatting outside the sheds. As Captain Lei arrived, a skinny middle-aged man soon walked out of the beast fight arena to greet him. This man's clothes were clearly different from scavengers. He had a three-stroke beard, and spirit energy fluctuations could similarly be felt from his body. After he arrived, his face showed a perfunctory smile as he glanced at Xu Qing before looking back at Captain Lei. Newbie. He already knows the rules, Captain Lei slowly spoke. What is his name? Asked the guy with the three-stroke beard * casually. He's just a brat, how would he have a name? Just call him Kid, answered Captain Lei calmly. Follow me then. Kid, your luck isn't bad. There are already a few people before you. You should be able to fight in one of the matches tomorrow. The guy with the three-stroke beard laughed as he turned and walked toward the wooden sheds. Now, Xu Qing looked at Captain Lei. Go. I will come and fetch you tomorrow. Captain Lei looked at Xu Qing with some anticipation in his eyes. Xu Qing then cast a deep glance at Captain Lei before nodding. He didn't continue to speak and began to follow the guy with the three-stroke beard. When they arrived before the wooden shed, the guy with the three-stroke beard gave a few instructions to the scavengers at the side before turning around to depart. And as for Xu Qing, he was arranged to stay in one of the wooden sheds and was told that he couldn't leave here without getting permission. The moment he stepped into this wooden shed, 4 pairs of eyes from different locations inside the house gathered on him. These eyes belonged to 4 youths whose ages were similar to him. There were 3 guys and 1 girl. 2 of the youths seemed to be a few years older than him. At this moment, their eyes swept over Xu Qing and surveyed him, but they didn't care too much. As for the girl, she was slightly younger than Xu Qing. She cowered in a corner and a large scar could be seen on her face. She nervously stared at everything in her surroundings warily, including the 3 male youths, as well as Xu Qing who had just arrived. As for the oldest youth here, he was originally a scavenger, but he changed to another campsite. So, after seeing Xu Qing, his lips curled as he felt some disdain. He then shifted his gaze. His eyes were filled with invasive intent as he stared at the girl while licking his lips. However, he who clearly hadn't obtained the residency right in this campsite didn't dare to be too impudent with his actions. Xu Qing ignored them. He found a location near the door and sat down cross-legged with his eyes closed as he quietly meditated. Time slowly passed. Maybe it was because Xu Qing's arrival was too quiet. Gradually the 3 male youths in the shed neglected him and began to chat among themselves. 2 of the youths clearly had hints of flattering in their tone when they chatted with the oldest youth. The content of their conversation was mostly about the martial training they had to go through this time around. Through their conversations, Xu Qing knew that this campsite would regularly organize a session of martial training when they had accumulated enough people who wanted to obtain residency rights here. The rules of the martial training were very simple. Because the camp leader of this campsite reared many mutated ferocious beasts, the martial training that would allow one to obtain a residency right would simply be a beast fight. The combatants would draw lots and fight against the ferocious beasts they drew. Either they lived, or they died to the monsters, becoming prey. Those who were alive could bring back their battle spoils and gain residency rights. Those who died would become food for raising the ferocious beasts. And every martial training would be organized in this place named the Beast Fight Arena. At the same time, most of the scavengers here would purchase tickets to watch this bloody show, and while obtaining satisfaction from it, the camp leader would also start bets to make a profit. In this cruel world, human lives were worthless. If one wasn't qualified to enter the city and also couldn't enter the camp, they would have no choice but to live in the wilderness. Their risk of dying would then become even greater. Naturally, going to the slums was a choice. But evidently, those who had chosen to join a scavenger campsite had their own reasons and stories. Xu Qing sat at the side while he listened. When their conversation steered to the god opening its eyes many days ago, one of the youth suddenly asked, "When I came here, I heard people saying that you are the lucky soul survivor from that calamity." As these words rang out, Xu Qing slowly opened his eyes. When he glanced over, he noticed that the youth wasn't talking about him but the little girl at the corner instead. The girl's body trembled and she silently nodded. Xu Qing's gaze landed on the little girl. Everyone only heard about the story, but he had experienced everything. So, he deeply understood that those who could survive in the calamity and arrive here wouldn't be so simple or fragile even though their appearances indicated that they were so. The little girl seemed to have noticed Xu Qing's gaze. She then lifted her head and looked at Xu Qing. However, Xu Qing closed his eyes again and continued to meditate. He had to grasp all available time to cultivate. This was the only thing he could depend on to live a better life. Just like this, a night passed. The next morning, as the clamor and hooting of the outside world rang out, the door to the wooden shed was opened by someone. Sunlight streamed in. The scavenger who opened the door stood in the doorway, and his figure caused his shadow to be cast into the house, enveloping the figure of the little girl in the corner. This man then coldly spoke. "Pack up and leave with me. The good show you guys are putting up will be shown soon. I've waited long enough." The scavenger youth was the first to rise. He smiled and walked over, greeting the person at the door. The two other youths also hurriedly followed him. Xu Qing was the fourth person to go out, and the little girl was the last one. The scavenger at the door was acquainted with that scavenger youth. After they chatted for a while, he ignored the others and led the youth to the beast fight arena. The nearer they got, the louder the clamor. Hooting and cheering rose forth in waves, growing in intensity. This lasted until the group of them stepped into the beast fight arena. The moment they did so, the commotion thoroughly erupted. They could see that on the surrounding tall chairs inside the beast fight arena, there were currently over 100 people spectating. Males and females grouped together rowdily as they prepared themselves to watch a good show. Their voices were very loud. Upon seeing this scene, the little girl's body evidently shivered and the two youths also had pale expressions. The only exception was the scavenger youth whose eyes gleamed with excitement as he stared at the audience. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Site only. Next was Xu Qing. His expression didn't change much, and he started observing the environment of the fighting area inside the beast fight arena. The space isn't very large, so it's unsuitable for kiting. Since there is no cover, it is also unsuitable for hiding. The surrounding wooden fences are very tall, so it's unsuitable to draw the danger to the audience. But there are signs of a few gates, there should be tunnels there. So either I borrow the cheers and shouts of the audience to frighten the beast, while I find an opportunity to act, but that might end up backfiring as it could cause the ferocious beast to rage, or I end things as swiftly as possible as that would be the most advantageous. Chapter 12, My Treat to You, 1. Outside of time. While Xu Qing was observing the environment of the fighting area, the sounds of cheering from the crowd echoed out. The entrance, where Xu Qing and the others had walked into earlier, now let out a booming sound as a huge gate slammed down. It smashed heavily against the ground surface, causing clouds of dust and soil to kick up. The sound was like a bugle horn being blown and caused the surrounding scavengers to become even more excited. Xu Qing also noticed that on that tall platform right in front of him, there was a middle-aged man clad in cotton clothes. A group of people followed him, and he sat in the highest seat. Because the distance was very far, his appearance was somewhat blurry. Evidently, the status of this person was extraordinary. Despite the far distance, Xu Qing could sense that the spirit energy fluctuations from the other party were extremely dense, surpassing everyone he had ever seen before. This caused Xu Qing to feel wary. At the same time, he had a guess in his heart. This person was probably the camp leader of this campsite. This was because Xu Qing saw the guy with the three-stroke beard from yesterday bending beside him, carefully giving the latter a report. As the camp leader sat down, the guy with the three-stroke beard stood on a tall platform and made a gesture to those below. Very soon, at the boundary of the beast fight arena, a wooden gate was opened. Now, waves of roars from ferocious beasts sounded even clearer without the obstruction of the wooden gate. And as the sounds echoed out, a group of scavengers emerged. They were split into 4 teams of 3, each carrying a large metal cage as they slowly walked out. Inside each metal cage, a ferocious beast could be seen roaring and prancing around, as though they wanted to tear the cage into pieces. Xu Qing rapidly glanced over and his gaze swept past the 4 metal cages. He saw that there were 2 giant wolves, one larger and one smaller. However, both their teeth were extremely sharp. Their bodies were pitch black, and their gazes were blood-colored. There were also large amounts of drool dripping from the corner of their mouths. As they stared at Xu Qing and the other 4, they revealed savage expressions. There was also a red-furred bear. Its thick arms were even larger than the thigh of an adult human. As for its expression, it was filled with violence as it continued to rattle the cage. The small team of 3 scavengers carrying it evidently found it very strenuous to do so. As for the ferocious beast in the last metal cage, its aura was clearly much weaker in comparison. It was a gibbon. Its body was covered in pustules, which looked like they would explode with a single touch. This was especially so since the gibbon seemed to be in very great pain. It kept slamming itself against the metal cage, causing a number of pustules to keep breaking. It was a shocking sight. Their appearances sent the surrounding audience into another uproar. In just a moment, the expressions of the 2 youths beside Xu Qing paled. That little girl also had intense terror in her eyes. As for that youth who was originally a scavenger, he was also much more nervous at this moment. Why are there only 4 creatures? Xu Qing was astonished as he glanced at the tunnel inside the wooden gate. At the moment he looked over, the 4 ferocious beasts in the cages who were struggling and roaring instantly fell silent. It was as though they were intimidated. And at the same time, a gigantic metal cage twice the size of the previous cages was slowly carried out by 6 scavengers from the wooden gate. As the gigantic metal cage appeared, the surrounding audience immediately exclaimed out loud, "Giant horn python." This time around, the camp leader actually managed to capture a giant horn python. But then again, in his eyes, this python can't be considered valuable at all. To these brats, whoever draws this python will surely die. Even if we encounter it in the wilderness, we will require 2 people to stake their lives before we can kill it. The ferocious beast inside was actually a gigantic python. The thickness of its body was comparable to the waist of a human adult, and the color of its body was a mix between gray and black. If one looked closely at the dark patterns, they looked like jagged mountain peaks. At this moment, it lay motionless in the cage. Its large head then slowly lifted, and its yellow vertical pupils shone with sinister coldness as it looked outside. Under its stare, regardless of the giant wolves or gibbon, they were all trembling. Only the red bear let out a low roar after being provoked. It looked like it didn't mind retaliating, but its body was actually slowly retreating. It retreated until it reached the back end of its metal cage. "Please don't let me draw it. Please don't let me draw it." Behind Xu Qing, the 2 youths immediately shivered. When the 2 of them were praying in low voices, a sharp glint of light appeared in Xu Qing's eyes. He knew about giant horn pythons. When he was in the slum, someone had hunted one and dragged the corpse back. At that time, he heard the experienced person saying that the strength of this python was very great. Once something was entangled by it, even giant logs of wood would be snapped. Besides, the python's skin was very thick. However, its body was clumsy and its speed comparatively couldn't be considered fast. In addition, its gallbladder contained very good medicinal potency. It would cleanse part of the taint in one's body. Also, the snake meat was very nutritious. When Xu Qing thought about this, he recalled that Captain Lei had told him that he liked eating snakes. Xu Qing had also caught plenty of snakes when he was younger. Hence, he couldn't help but lick his lips. Also, the mutation point on his body grew darker and darker the more he cultivated. Yesterday during his cultivation, he faintly felt some piercing pain radiating from it. Xu Qing was thinking that if he could eat the snake's gallbladder, much of the taint in the mutation point might be neutralized. While he was staring at the giant horn python, the lot drawing started. A scavenger arranged by the guy with the 3-stroke beard carried 5 bamboo sticks with him as he walked over. Each of the bamboo sticks contained the names of the ferocious beast in this martial training session. The oldest youth was the first to draw. When he saw the bamboo stick he drew, he clearly heaved a sigh of relief. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Site only. After that, it was the 2 other male youths and the little girl. The expressions of the 2 youths were slightly bitter as they prayed while drawing the lots. However, the gaze of the little girl was filled with despair when she looked at the lot she drew. The bamboo slip in her hand was none other than the one that corresponded with the giant horn python. Hence, the last of the 5 bamboo sticks was the smaller wolf. This was also clearly the weakest ferocious beast among the 5. Xu Qing took that bamboo slip and frowned as he pondered. Very soon, the scavenger departed. They, the combatants, were then arranged behind a corner barricade. As the cheering of the surrounding audience rang out, the first match began. Chapter 13, My Treat to You, 2. Outside of time. The person arranged to make an entrance was one of the 2 youths. He walked out shivering. The ferocious beast set against him was none other than that muscular red bear. The fighting process was very quick. That youth basically wasn't a match for the red bear. After barely clashing a few times, he was overpowered. Eventually, his body was directly torn apart while he was in despair. As a result, fresh blood splattered in 4 directions, causing a commotion in the surroundings. There was also the sound of cursing that was filled with regret. This scene caused the other youth to be so scared that his body shivered unceasingly. He, who was originally supposed to fight in the second round, suddenly shouted loudly that he wanted to give up the match. Hence, under the booing from the crowd, Xu Qing saw the youth being brought away by the scavengers. As for the youth's ending, it was clear even without thinking about it. The person arranged to go for the third match was the scavenger youth. He had managed to draw the larger black wolf, but his experience as a scavenger made him much more ruthless compared to an ordinary person. After a shocking life and death battle, he panted heavily and killed that wolf while suffering many injuries. He became the first case of success in martial training this time around. The gate opened. After that, he clutched his chest and left freely. The 4th match was the little girl. When the cage of the giant horn python was unlocked, the girl shivered and gritted her teeth. She was about to walk past Xu Qing in despair to fight the battle. But at this moment, Xu Qing suddenly spoke. "Let us swap." The girl started, but before she could react, Xu Qing already swapped the bamboo stick he had drawn with her. The moment he took the bamboo stick with the python's name, he no longer bothered with the look of gratitude the girl showed him. He directly walked toward the giant horn python. As he entered, the surrounding scavengers immediately caused an uproar. Evidently, they had seen the sequence of matches earlier. However, other than the gamblers who bet on him and the girl, the other spectators wouldn't care about things like this. They wouldn't care and neither would the camp leader. Everyone was free to choose their life or death. In the beast fight arena, Xu Qing calmly moved toward the cage. At the same time, the giant horn python within coldly stared at Xu Qing as it slowly crawled out. When its thick and muscular body emerged from the metal cage, its scales caused an ear-piercing grinding sound as they brushed across the metal poles of the cage. Its animalistic instinct felt that this youth before its eyes was different from the prey it usually met. So, after it crawled out, this giant horn python didn't attack immediately. Rather, it coiled its body outside the metal cage and lifted its head high warily, staring at Xu Qing who was continuously moving closer to it. This scene caused the surrounding audience to be filled with excitement. The sounds of the commotion also reduced slightly. Xu Qing's expression was as calm as ever, and he slowly moved nearer step by step. Maybe it was because he had entered the giant horn python's attack range, or maybe because it was provoked by his aura. The yellow vertical pupils of the giant horn python flashed with a cold murderous intent, and its tail violently slammed against the ground, creating a loud bang. As this explosive sound rang out, its body borrowed the pushing force from the tail and ferociously charged forward. After that, the gigantic snake maw opened wide in the air, revealing malicious sharp fangs and letting out a pungent smell to the air. Its head whooshed through the air, wanting to devour Xu Qing. Seeing this scene, Xu Qing narrowed his eyes and coldly watched the giant horn python rapidly charging over. The instant the snake got near, his body dodged to the side. However, he didn't choose to counterattack using this opportunity or care about the large snake head that passed by him. His gaze only gleamed coldly like a hunter as he attentively observed the belly of this python. From his observation, he saw the python missing its attack and letting out a low roar of annoyance. It then twisted its body, and its tail slammed the ground again, creating the ear-piercing whistling sound as it ferociously lunged at Xu Qing. Its hunting instincts made the python forcibly turn at this moment. Its head flexed toward its tail, as though they were about to join together, forming a circle as it charged at Xu Qing, wanting to entangle him in its coil. Xu Qing was silent. His gaze was still closely observing the belly of the giant horn snake. When the snake's tail got close, his right hand suddenly clenched and punched out the instant the tail lashed over. Bang! Although his cultivation of the mountains and seas art was only at the first level, the augmentation it provided Xu Qing's strength wasn't small. At this moment, when the snake's tail got blasted away, it folded backward directly, unable to coil toward its head. The giant horn python clearly felt some pain, but it wasn't fatal, so it only caused its anger to surge greatly. Its eyes then turned red as its head rammed over, wanting to devour Xu Qing with a single bite. Xu Qing focused his eyes as sharpness gleamed within, having found the spot he was looking for. At this moment, he strode over, choosing to advance instead of retreating and directly climbing onto the middle section of the giant horn python's body. After that, he exerted force and punched out ruthlessly with his right hand. 1 punch, 2 punches, 3 punches. His punches blasted out. The impact of Xu Qing's fists made the giant horn python continuously retreat. Its roars grew even more intense as it attempted to coil around Xu Qing. However, the strength contained within Xu Qing's punches made it hard for it to coil around. As for the belly part that was being pummeled, due to the scales there being weaker, after several punches, cracks actually appeared and blood seeped out. This was the first time it got injured. After seeing this, Xu Qing's eyes flashed with a cold light, and he didn't wait for the giant horn python to change its posture. His left hand immediately shot toward the dagger on his thigh. As the dagger glimmered coldly, he plunged it into the flesh of the giant horn python in an incomparably ferocious manner. It instantly broke through the flesh and stabbed inside ruthlessly. As a result, blood splattered around. Amidst the mournful hisses of the giant horn python, a shocking wound was torn through its belly, revealing a whole snake gallbladder. This snake was very large and clearly showed signs of mutation. However, the gallbladder was very small, only the size of an egg. Even so, Xu Qing didn't hesitate. His right hand stretched into the wound, and he grabbed the gallbladder before pulling it out forcefully. Under the sharp cries of the python, he forcibly took the gallbladder out. Fresh blood then splattered on the sand and soil below. Xu Qing ignored the blood stains, and a strange light gleamed in his eyes as he held the gallbladder. Glancing at the surrounding scavengers who had a variety of expressions, he directly placed the gallbladder in his mouth and swallowed it. While he was calmly swallowing it, the giant horn python whose gallbladder was forcibly removed was struggling madly from the pain. Its hisses grew increasingly mournful, and its body was whacking the ground heavily, causing clouds of sand and dust to kick up. It felt like the snake wanted to vent the intense pain it was feeling. After that, its head knocked toward Xu Qing even more ferociously. Its blood-red eyes now showed a hint of craziness as it widened its maw to the extreme limits as though wanting to swallow Xu Qing completely. However, Xu Qing only glared at it icily. The instant the snake got near, he suddenly leaped up and once again evaded the snake's head. He, who was now in midair, brandished his right hand, and the black-colored iron stick appeared. When he lowered his head, killing intent flashed in his eyes. His body heavily landed, and he borrowed the momentum to increase his strength, speed, and body weight to plunge the iron stick ruthlessly with the greatest impact he could muster into the heart area of the python. As a result, the snake's scales in that area cracked under Xu Qing's monstrous strength, and he penetrated the snake's heart with a single blow. An explosive sound echoed out. This giant horn snake's body then trembled intensely like it no longer had the strength to support its body. After that, its head and tail heavily landed on the ground, and its mournful hiss abruptly stopped. Only the weak sounds of its tail thrashing on the ground could be heard. A long time later, when the clouds of dust and soil had settled down, the scavengers spectating this battle were still badly shocked. Many people stood up and stared at the scene in the beast fight arena with heavy expressions. At this moment, the youth was plucking his iron stick out from the snake's corpse. If an adult killed the giant horn python like this, it wouldn't cause them to have such expressions. However, for a small and skinny kid to do all these, the kid had cleanly devoured the snake gallbladder after snatching it forcefully and killed it in a single blow the next moment with no changes to his cold expression. In the camp, such a scene was very rarely seen. The smaller wolf and red bear in the cage were evidently frightened as well, and they were both trembling. This wasn't martial training but a hunt. Under the stares of everyone, the youth put his iron stick away. One of his hands then grabbed onto the wounded part of the giant horn python, and he walked toward the large gate of the beast fight arena. Behind him, the fresh blood of the giant horn python left a red trail behind. It was truly a shocking sight. Standing next to the closed gate, Xu Qing turned his head and glanced at the high platform. The guy with the three-stroke beard only came back to his senses after some time. After that, he felt some lingering fear as he immediately showed a hand gesture. Very soon later, the huge gate rumbled as it opened. After Xu Qing exited, he saw Captain Lei with his arms crossed leaning against a wall. Clearly, Captain Lei had waited for a long time. He smiled as he looked at Xu Qing. "Can I stay at your place now?" Xu Qing dragged the snake corpse along as he inclined his head and looked at Captain Lei. "You can." Captain Lei smiled. Xu Qing nodded and tossed the snake corpse over. "Since you like to eat snakes, this is my treat to you." Captain Lei was stunned. After that, he laughed uproariously as he caught hold of the giant horn python's corpse. As he laughed, he brought Xu Qing along and gradually walked away. Meanwhile, only after they had walked far away did the audience inside the beast fight arena erupt forth with an explosive uproar. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Site only. Amidst the commotion, in a corner of the crowd, an old man wearing purple robes sat with an expressionless middle-aged man who seemed like a servant. The glabella of the middle-aged man had a 5-point star totem. Regardless of their clothes or demeanor, they were clearly out of place when they sat there. However, no one seemed to be able to see their existence. Even the camp leader's vision couldn't detect their figures at all. The old man had a rosy face, and there seemed to be lightning concealed in his gaze. It felt like everything could be destroyed if he unleashed it. All in all, his entire being was extremely extraordinary. At this moment, he sat there and stared at the departing back of Xu Qing as he couldn't help but laugh. This youth is pretty interesting. Chapter 14, 3 sets of chopsticks and bowls. Outside of time. At the scavenger campsite, Captain Lei walked in front while Xu Qing followed. The sunlight was currently streaming down, landing on them. From afar, despite the sight of one being tall and one being short, one being old and one being young, there was actually a faint sense of harmony. It was as though in this cruel world, such a sense of harmony was very hard to find. Or maybe it was the python corpse in Captain Lei's hand that exuded a sense of threat, causing the passers-by in the surroundings, who hadn't been to the beast fight arena, to not disturb them. Xu Qing liked this feeling very much. Regardless of whether they were eating the snake later or enjoying the sunlight at this moment, both made him feel very warm. He felt very comfortable and yearned for this. Every time his gaze landed on the python corpse that Captain Lei held, he could feel more saliva in his mouth. He was also fond of eating snakes. Captain Lei's house was located in the center ring region of the campsite. Compared to the brick houses in the inner ring region and the crude tents in the outer ring region, the houses in the center ring region were mostly constructed using stones and wood. In addition, 3 small houses would usually be built in a row together. Although the space within each house wasn't that wide, Xu Qing could see that it was much better compared to the place he had lived in the slums. This was especially so considering the fact that Captain Lei's house still had a small courtyard. This was even rarer to come by. At this moment, he pushed the bamboo gate leading to the courtyard open. Under Xu Qing's observation, Captain Lei walked to the secondary room in his house. He then casually pointed to the second tiny house and spoke. "Kid, you can stay here from now on. You should first get yourself familiarized with the surroundings. I will call for you once the meal is cooked." After speaking, Captain Lei began his preparation and the sound of meat being chopped rang out later. Xu Qing gulped down his saliva. He first observed the tiny courtyard carefully before entering the second house. There was a bed, a quilt, a table, and a chair there. Other than these things, there were no other objects. The ground was very clean, there was also no dust on the table and chair. Evidently, they were often cleaned by someone. Even the quilt was washed until it was very clean. There was the smell of it being dried by the sun. Everything made Xu Qing feel very satisfied. He didn't like a large house. What he liked was a house where he could see everything in one glance, a small house where he could project everything in his mind. This would make him feel safer. Hence, after a meticulous check, Xu Qing looked at the clean bed. He pondered for a moment but didn't go over, choosing to directly sit on the ground instead. He sat cross-legged and closed his eyes, beginning today's cultivation. During cultivation, as the spirit energy flowed into him, the sound of oil crackling could be heard from the house next door. Very soon, waves of fragrance flowed through the tiny gaps of stone and wood on the wall and permeated his small house. This also whetted Xu Qing's appetite, causing him to feel a sense of hunger as his stomach produced grumbling noises. It smelled very fragrant. Xu Qing's throat involuntarily moved as he opened his eyes and glanced in the direction of the secondary room. After living for so many years in the slums, he already couldn't remember when was the last time he smelled such fragrance. Hence, he suppressed the hunger in his stomach and closed his eyes to calm himself down before continuing with his cultivation. Just like this, time slowly passed. Very soon, the evening had arrived. When the voice of Captain Lei rang out from outside, asking him to come and eat, Xu Qing, who had just ended a day of cultivation, immediately opened his eyes. He stood up and swiftly exited the house. He then saw Captain Lei standing at the end room waving his hands to him. Beside Captain Lei, Xu Qing saw that there were 7 to 8 different snake dishes placed on the dining table. Some were deep-fried, some were braised, some were steamed, and there was even snake soup. Evidently, Captain Lei had extremely good cooking skills, and the dishes he prepared were excellent in their tastes, appearances, and smells. Xu Qing's eyes couldn't turn away his gaze after he took a look. Looking at this, Captain Lei laughed and turned to pick up sets of chopsticks and bowls. Xu Qing also moved closer and entered the end room. The fragrance was even thicker here. However, he didn't sit down immediately. Rather, his gaze suddenly froze after he saw Captain Lei placing the sets of chopsticks and bowls. There were 3 sets of chopsticks and bowls. There's someone else. Although the fragrance was very tempting, the appearance of the 3 sets of chopsticks and bowls caused Xu Qing to cast the temptation aside. He cautiously looked at Captain Lei and asked in a soft voice, "You don't have to be nervous. This is a habit of mine. That is for a person who would never come." Captain Lei calmly spoke as recollection flashed in the depths of his eyes. However, that look of recollection soon disappeared, and he sat down on a chair. Xu Qing nodded and sat down as well. He couldn't control his urges anymore and directly took a piece of deep-fried snake meat. He then put it into his mouth and began to chew. It was very hot, but he was also extremely satisfied as he ate it. His mouth was full of grease. After he finished eating one piece, he licked the grease above his mouth and his hand stretched out to grab the braised snake meat. But at this moment, Captain Lei coughed lightly. "Use the chopsticks." "Oh." Xu Qing clumsily took the chopsticks and after a period of getting used to it, he carried a piece of braised snake meat into his mouth and wolfed it down ravenously. During the entire process of the meal, both didn't speak. It was just that their eating appearances were completely not a match. Captain Lei chewed the meat slowly before he swallowed them, not looking like a scavenger. He only tried 2 to 3 pieces for every dish. As for Xu Qing, he was ravenously wolfing down the meat. His appetite far surpassed Captain Lei's. Seeing how Xu Qing ate, Captain Lei couldn't help but speak. "Why was it so different back then when I gave you the bun? You ate the bun small mouthful by mouthful." Xu Qing forcefully swallowed the piece of snake meat in his mouth. He then lifted his head and looked at Captain Lei as he seriously answered. "The buns belong to you, but this snake meat belongs to me. One was food others treated him to. The other was food he was treating others to." The thinking process of this youth was very simple. Since this belonged to him, he naturally would eat it in a way that perfectly justified the fact. Captain Lei didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He then looked at Xu Qing, who kept picking up pieces of snake meat to eat while also drinking the snake soup. However, he also noticed that the youth didn't eat from every snake dish. He only took meat from the dishes near him, and he also drank the snake soup with restraint. He only ate the portion that belonged to him in such a way. "Your python is extremely huge, so it is enough for us to eat for half a month. In addition, its skin and bones have some value as well." So, Captain Lei casually spoke. "I will pay you rent." "You don't have to deduct the rent from these," Xu Qing suddenly said. The snake meat was to repay Captain Lei for the buns and sleeping bag. The value of the snake skin and snake bones was to pay back Captain Lei for helping him conceal the matter about broken ox. As for Captain Lei bringing him away from the ruins and to the campsite, that was a debt of gratitude. Xu Qing felt that it was somewhat inappropriate if he tried to repay the debt by giving material objects. So, he remembered the favor in his heart instead. Captain Lei cast a deep glance at Xu Qing and could see the seriousness in the youth's eyes as well as his personality of clearly separating grudges and kindness. Hence, he nodded. After he pondered, he spoke again. "Kid, you probably had many guesses about my identity when we were on our way here." Xu Qing didn't speak, but his eating action slowed slightly. "The others call me Captain Lei. As for my name, it is not important. In the scavenger campsite, no one will use their real name." Captain Lei picked up a piece of steamed snake meat and placed it into his mouth as he slowly chewed. "As to why I have this title, it was because, in the scavenger camp, I met a few friends who were willing to share life and death with me. We form a small team, but the name of our small team is a little crude. It's known as Thunder. Usually, everyone will accept individual missions. If we encounter a mission with greater difficulty, our team will gather and complete it together. Including me, there are a total of 4 people, but the 3 of them are still out and have yet to return. After they return, I will introduce you to them. In the future, you can follow us and become a new member of Team Thunder. You will then be able to do missions to earn a living as well as cultivation resources." Captain Lei seemed to be somewhat full. He put his chopsticks down and looked at Xu Qing. Xu Qing wasn't surprised by the words cultivation resources. Even Xu Qing could somehow sense that Captain Lei was a rogue cultivator. After having interacted with each other for such a long time, even if Xu Qing was in the body refinement realm **, Captain Lei would naturally be able to sense it through his observation. Sure. Xu Qing didn't hesitate as he nodded his head. This caused him to breathe a sigh of relief in his heart. He who grew up in the slums deeply knew that it was impossible for someone to show kindness and offer help while wanting nothing in return. There was a reason for everything. You can continue eating. I'm already old and won't be able to digest the food if I eat too much. Captain Lei coughed a few times and his face turned a little red. However, he soon recovered. He stood up and walked toward the outside as he spoke. The spirit energy in this world is like poison. If you keep cultivating so assiduously as you did on the way here, your body might not be able to last very long before the mutation overcomes it. Cultivation requires one to build a solid foundation. You must not be hasty. Xu Qing fell silent and didn't speak. The old man who walked to the door turned and looked at Xu Qing as he shook his head. However, by cultivating like this, you are also correct. The scavenger campsite lies beside a forbidden zone, and it is different from the one you were in previously. The items and objects within the forbidden zone cause many low-level rogue cultivators and fugitives to gather here. Since you are staying here, you will surely need to make a trip to the forbidden zone sooner or later. So, cultivating more is also good. Captain Lei then left. Xu Qing sat here alone until he finished all the snake meat. However, he didn't leave immediately. He first cleaned and put the tableware down before he returned to his small house. Upon returning, he sat down cross-legged and continued to cultivate. Xu Qing was very clear that if he didn't want to struggle whilst on death's door and bend his back to survive, leaving the right of his life and death in the hands of others, his own strength would be the root of everything. This was especially so in the scavenger camp. There were plenty of rogue cultivators here, far more than the number he had seen in his 6 years in the slums. Not a single one of these people was a pushover. If the slums were a nest for dogs, this place was a den for wolves. If he didn't work hard, even before he mutated, he might have already died without a burial place because of a conflict or dispute. As for the anomalous substances in his body, Xu Qing learned from the bamboo slip that contained the mountains and seas art that alchemy pills might be able to neutralize them. Although they could only treat the symptoms and not the root, the pills could still be used to cope with mutation. On the way here, he also learned the name of one of such pills from the conversations of the scavengers. The pill was named white pills. In the nearby forbidden zone, an important herb necessary for the concoction of white pills was produced there. So, there would surely be people selling white pills inside the campsite. After thinking of this, Xu Qing touched the location of the purple crystal in his chest. During this period, he clearly sensed that other than granting him a boost in recovery, it also provided a huge increase in his strength and speed. This had something to do with him achieving the first level of the mountains and seas art. However, Xu Qing felt that his first level seemed to be somewhat different from the introduction of the first level described on the bamboo slip, where he would gain a tiger's worth of strength upon reaching the first level. I think I can beat many tigers to death. Xu Qing mused silently as he sensed the spirit energy in his body. On the way here, he had been assiduously cultivating and he was soon about to break through to the second level. Today, I will attempt to break through to the second level. Xu Qing's gaze revealed determination. He then closed his eyes and started his breathing exercise. Very soon, spirit energy fluctuations flooded over from all directions. The spirit energy outside forbidden zones had much fewer anomalous substances in comparison to the spirit energy within forbidden zones, and so it could increase the cultivator's cultivation speed by quite a bit. For this point, Xu Qing had discovered it yesterday when he was in the wooden shed of the beast fight arena. At this moment, he relaxed his body and exerted force to absorb the spirit energy in conjunction with his breathing. There was also a weak flash of purple light from his chest that was covered by the leather coat. Time flowed by. Gradually, light popping sounds echoed from Xu Qing's body, and his pores began to secrete black-colored impurities once again. The flesh and blood of his entire body seemed to be nourished and became more tenacious. It was like there was a greater strength within them that was gradually bursting out. And at the same time, in the darkness outside, the little girl whose bamboo stick got swapped by Xu Qing walked toward the courtyard Xu Qing was in. She stood there and hesitated. It was like she wanted to knock on the gate but also felt some trepidation. After a long time, she seemed to have gathered the courage and knocked lightly on the bamboo gate of the courtyard. It was just that the sound of such knocking was too weak. There was basically no way for it to be transmitted within. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Site only. The moment the little girl knocked on the gate, the popping sounds from Xu Qing's body also reached their most intense moment. As a rumbling sound roared in his mind, Xu Qing opened his eyes. At this moment, purple light flashed in his eyes once again as joy appeared on his face. He then lowered his head and glanced at his arm. The second mutation point had appeared there. The second level of qi condensation. 1. The end room seemed to be connected to the second house where Xu Qing is staying. 2. Xu Qing is in the qi condensation realm, but the Ross used here was body refinement. Might refer to the cultivation art Xu Qing practiced. The mountains and seas art is said to be one that tempers and refine one's body. You can view the reference from Chapter 6 if you are interested. Chapter 15, Consequences of Threat. 1. Outside of time. I've finally broken through. Xu Qing stood up and punched out, producing a crisp sound echoing through the air. In fact, the blast of wind even caused the door to the house to shake a little. This scene caused Xu Qing's eyes to open wide. He sensed that the current him was simply much stronger compared to yesterday. If the current him fought against that giant horned snake, Xu Qing believed that he could blast through the belly scales of the snake with a single punch. Not only that, but his senses were also sharper than before. His vision was clearer, and his hearing also became more sensitive. Hence, the sounds of knocking from outside the courtyard could now drift into Xu Qing's ears. Xu Qing started and walked to the side of the house's door. Under the moonlight, he peered through the gap and saw the figure of the little girl standing outside the courtyard's gate. It seemed that she had injuries on her body, and she was trembling slightly. Xu Qing frowned. He originally didn't want to bother about this, but the girl persisted and continued to knock lightly. Hence, a long time later, Xu Qing finally pushed the door of the house open and walked out. After seeing Xu Qing's figure, the girl evidently grew nervous. She bore the impulse to retreat and stared at Xu Qing through the bamboo gate. Is something the matter? Xu Qing asked. I also obtained the residency right of the campsite A, and also found a job in the campsite. The little stuttered a little as she spoke. Understood. Xu Qing nodded and was about to turn and leave. Wait, thank you. I came here to thank you, said the girl hurriedly. No need to thank me. It was me who wanted to eat the snake. This has nothing to do with you. After Xu Qing finished speaking, he returned to the house. The girl pursed her lips as she looked at Xu Qing's departing back. She suddenly spoke loudly. No matter what, I still have to thank you. This debt of gratitude, I will surely repay you in the future. After she finished speaking, her figure ran away and vanished into the darkness. Xu Qing turned and glanced over, not minding this at all. He then returned to the house and drew in a deep breath, sensing the changes in his body. In his heart, he felt more confident about his thoughts of living a better life. However, the faint piercing pain that originated from his left arm made him guess that the anomalous substances in his body must have been concentrated to a very high degree. Even the snake gallbladder didn't manage to neutralize much. At this moment, it was in the dead of the night, and there were no roars from ferocious beasts outside. Xu Qing then walked to his bedside and saw the clean bedding there before he took another look at his clothes, which were filled with dirt and grime. He pondered a little before removing the clean bedding. After placing it to the side, he lay down on the wooden plank. His hand instinctively grabbed the black-colored iron stick as waves of sleepiness surfaced. This iron stick was the companion he trusted the most. Ever since he had found it after searching through the garbage many years ago, he had decided to bring it everywhere with him and use it as his own weapon after discovering how sharp and durable it was. I will search the campsite for a place that sells white pills tomorrow. Xu Qing silently mused as he touched his leather pouch. Inside was his savings of these few years as well as a few valuable gems he had found inside the city. He didn't dare to take too many gems as he understood the logic of the weak possessing a jade ring becomes a crime. He had seen cases like that when he was younger. As he contemplated, the feeling of sleepiness slowly overcame him, and Xu Qing gradually closed his eyes. It was just that the iron stick in his hand was still clutched tightly, with no sign of relaxation. The calm night passed as the rays of the morning sun cascaded down. The next morning, Xu Qing, who woke up early, had already left the small house. Before he departed, he looked in the direction of Captain Lei's room. The other party wasn't in, so maybe he had gone out. Hence, Xu Qing retracted his gaze and went to wander around the campsite. Maybe it was due to the shock he had caused everyone when he forcibly harvested the gallbladder of the snake yesterday. When Xu Qing was walking in the camp, he could clearly feel the gazes of the scavengers in the surroundings. They were somewhat different when they looked at him now. They no longer felt that he was easy to bully because he was young. From this, one could see the evil of human nature. Now, there were more hints of recognition and vigilance. At the same time, the listless gaze of those youths around the same age as him, who were hiding in corners now, had a hint of envy when they looked at him. Dignity was something one had to obtain by themselves. Xu Qing silently mused in his heart. While he was searching for shops at the campsite, Xu Qing also familiarized himself with the surroundings. He discovered quite a lot of wild dogs in the camp. They were barking at each other and snatching goods. Most of them were thin, but some looked even more muscular and sturdy than some of the humans. After paying attention to these wild dogs, Xu Qing continued to observe the campsite. He did so until the map of the campsite was fully created in his mind. According to his mental map, he found a shop in the inner circle area of the campsite. The shop wasn't small and there were streams of people leaving and entering. This looked like a lively place, and it seemed to sell everything within. Xu Qing observed it for a while from outside and noticed the little girl from yesterday with a staff attire in the shop. Clearly, she must be doing miscellaneous jobs here. She seemed very busy, and droplets of sweat covered her forehead. She only noticed Xu Qing after he walked into the shop. However, just when she was about to speak, she was dragged to the side by a scavenger who wanted to inquire about an item. Xu Qing didn't immediately pay attention to the things for sale in the shop. Rather, he first took a look at the people in the surroundings who came to shop. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Site only. There were a total of 7 people. Some were browsing through the items for sale, some had their heads lowered as they contemplated, and some were bargaining. 2 among them, one skinny and one fat, seemed to be part of a group. The fat guy had a rotund figure, while the skinny guy had a horse-like face. Evidently, their attitudes were unyielding, and spirit energy fluctuations that weren't weak radiated from them. One of them was currently scolding the little girl as though he was very unsatisfied with her answers. And as the little girl anxiously apologized, Xu Qing began to check out the merchandise in the shop. Things were the same as what he had guessed. This place was a general goods shop. There were alchemy pills, weapons, clothes, food, etc. They had everything. Hence, he retracted his gaze and walked to the counter. He then calmly spoke as he looked at the shopkeeper who had an indifferent expression when he smoked a pipe. Chapter 16, Consequences of Threat, 2. Outside of time. How are the white pills sold? The white pills are limited, so we only sell 5 of them per day. There are still 2 pills remaining in the quota today. Each pill costs 10 spirit coins. The shopkeeper lifted his brows and swept a glance at Xu Qing. Maybe it was because he recognized that Xu Qing was the youth who had fought against the beasts yesterday. His attitude was somewhat friendlier. However, after hearing the price, despite Xu Qing being mentally prepared, he still couldn't help but frown slightly. His savings after these few years were at most 20 to 30 spirit coins. However, the piercing pain from the mutation point on his arm didn't cause him to hesitate. He carefully took out 20 spirit coins from his leather pouch and handed them to the shopkeeper. The shopkeeper kept the spirit coins with his right hand and took out a sack from a cabinet, tossing it to Xu Qing. Xu Qing grabbed it and opened the sack, revealing 2 white-colored alchemy pills within. However, his brows soon knitted again. Some parts of the surface layer of these 2 alchemy pills had turned greenish. Evidently, this was caused by a change in the quality, and they weren't very fresh. There was also no medicinal fragrance emitting from them. It looked like they were inferior pills. All white pills in the campsite are like this. We don't have any pills with good appearances here. For this item, even if it is rotted, it will still have some effect. You can rest assured and consume them. After the shopkeeper saw Xu Qing's bewilderment, he couldn't help but speak while having an insincere smile on his face. Xu Qing was very cautious, so he didn't consume them immediately. He planned to ask Captain Lei after he returned. Hence, he packed them up and wanted to leave. But at this moment, a gleam of sharpness flashed in his eyes, and his body quickly moved to the side. Almost at the same time as he evaded, a hand landed at the location he had been in previously, grabbing the air. Xu Qing coldly looked over and saw the scavenger with a horse face, who was previously berating the little girl, standing there with his hand retracted and looking at him with an astonished expression. At the same time, the scavenger with a rotund body stood at the entrance to block the way out as he stared at Xu Qing. He then grinned, revealing yellow teeth. They are Fat Mountain and Horse 4 from the Blood Shadow team. This kid should be someone Captain Lei brought back. Thunder and Blood Shadow have always been against each other, so I won't participate in your matters. However, don't waste too much time as I'm still running a business. The others in the shop also had their attention drawn by the actions of the 2. After they looked over, they began to whisper in low voices. The sentence spoken earlier was naturally from the indifferent-looking shopkeeper. At this moment, the pedestrians outside also noticed the commotion here. All of them looked inside with expressions of interest. Don't worry, this won't take long. The guy with a horse face smiled. He then looked at Xu Qing as his eyes gleamed sinisterly. Kid, I've killed plenty of giant horn pythons, so I won't make things difficult for you. I only need the white pills. Give me the 2 white pills you just bought and I will let you leave here safely. If not, I will help slit your throat and take the white pills from your corpse. These words caused Xu Qing's gaze to turn even colder. He looked at the other party's neck and the fatty blocking the entrance. Noticing that there were quite a lot of people outside, he started coming up with a plan. The spirit fluctuations from these 2 fellows weren't weak at all. They should be around the 2nd level. He was confident to deal with one of them as he was sure he could finish the fight in the span of 10 breaths. However, if the 2 of them cooperated, he would also be able to kill them, but it would take longer. In addition, this was the downtown area. Once the fight began, since the other parties were members of a team, they would surely have reinforcement. He didn't wish to put all his hope on praying that Captain Lei would arrive in time. This wasn't his personality. He didn't like putting hope in others as depending on himself was the best solution. Hence, Xu Qing expressionlessly swept his glance at the neck of the scavenger with a horse face again. His right hand then took out the sack containing the white pills and tossed it over with no hesitation. After the other party caught it, he turned his head back to glance at the fatty before he laughed complacently. His companion, Fat Mountain, also laughed and moved aside from the entrance. After that, Xu Qing didn't even turn his head and walked out immediately. The surrounding crowds, be it whether they were in the shop or outside, felt that this was very normal. Under the rules where the weak were eaten by the strong, the weak naturally had to know when to bow down. This was the path of survival. The little girl also heaved a sigh of relief. Earlier, she had been sweating profusely. Now that she saw that the crisis had been averted, she continued to busy herself. As for Fat Mountain and Horse 4, they swaggered out of the shop while laughing uproariously as they walked into the distance. It was just that, no one noticed that a figure, which seemed as though it had vanished after walking a great distance away, was following them like a shadow patiently, not exposing itself in the slightest. Its eyes were like a wolf staring at prey, paying close attention to the 2 of them. This figure was none other than Xu Qing. Time flowed and the sky gradually darkened. Fat Mountain and Horse 4 went to many places in the campsite, and even after an entire day had passed, they didn't notice that a figure had been following them from the start. The 2 of them finally separated when the moon was high in the sky. The place Fat Mountain went to had a bonfire, while Horse 4 showed an expression of lust as he headed to the dark area in the outer perimeters of the campsite, planning on entering one of the feathered tents. Just when Horse 4 was about to arrive at the dark area, he suddenly heard the sound of wind gushing behind him. Hence, Horse 4 turned around immediately with vigilance, but there was nothing behind him. He started and his expression couldn't help but change. It was already too late. An instant later, a small hand shot out beside him, tightly clamping his mouth. At the same time, a sharp dagger sliced forcefully across his throat without hesitation at all. Whoosh, fresh blood spurted all around. As a result, Horse 4's eyes were wide open and he wanted to struggle. However, the small hand that clamped down on his mouth possessed very great strength. Horse 4's body was then dragged backward, and it was futile no matter how much he struggled. His feet could only helplessly tap on the ground, unable to stop him from being dragged into the darkness. Finally, his end was like that of a slain chicken, tossed into a corner. Even until now, the small hand clamped on his mouth didn't move away. The owner of the hand waited for a long time, and only after he was sure that Horse 4 had lost all resistance from suffocation and blood loss did he finally relax his hand. He then slammed Horse 4's weak and shivering body onto the ground. Only now did the despairing Horse 4 see the expressionless face of the youth clearly with the aid of the dim moonlight. Woo, woo. Horse 4's gaze contained disbelief. Never in his wildest dreams did he imagine that the youth who had obediently handed the white pills to him in the morning would be so decisive and ruthless when he acted. He seemed as though he wanted to tell the youth that his words of slitting the youth's throat in the morning had been nothing but a threat. He wouldn't have really killed him. However, the blood gushing out of his throat made it impossible for him to speak. With despair, he could only whimper weakly and looked at the youth who was crouching down and emotionlessly searching through his pockets. When everything was taken out, Xu Qing found his white pills with an additional 5 more. Other than these, the other party also had some spirit coins and miscellaneous items. After Xu Qing kept them, as Horse 4's terror reached an extreme limit, Xu Qing removed the sackcloth covering a snake head carefully and used the snake's fangs to pierce Horse 4's body with great familiarity. As a result, Horse 4's body instantly convulsed and started melting from the location of the wound. The pain and agony from being melted alive caused him to break down mentally. Only until Xu Qing lifted his hand and covered Horse 4's eyes did Horse 4's world lose its light forever. His body melted and became blood that seeped into the earth. Xu Qing had learned his lesson from his previous negligence. At this moment, he took out a prepared pouch and put Horse 4's clothing and items away before he turned to leave. And after he left, 2 figures appeared from the darkness at the location of Horse 4's death. They were none other than the 2 men no one could see yesterday in the beast fight arena. One of them was an extraordinary old man clad in purple and the other was his servant. The old man lowered his head to look at the pool of blood seeping into the ground before lifting his head to glance at Xu Qing's back in the distance. A hint of admiration could be seen in his eyes. This is a good seedling. He has great tolerance and is decisive when it comes to killing. What's even rarer is that although he's ruthless when he acts, he can still handle the aftermath cleanly. Not bad at all, said the old man. The servant who was at the side revealed a surprised expression. He had followed this old man for many years, and it was very rare for him to hear the old man praising others as not bad. In addition, this youth had caught the attention of the old man twice. Hence, he also lifted his head to stare in the direction where Xu Qing vanished. An interesting little fellow. The old man smiled before casually asking another question. When will Grandmaster Bai arrive again? Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Site only. Old Master 7th, according to Grandmaster Bai's schedule, he should arrive here in 1 or 2 days. The servant withdrew his gaze and respectfully spoke. He's finally going to arrive. This time around, this old man has to properly persuade him. The stupid purple earth is full of stupid rules. What's there to miss? He might as well come and join my 7 blood eyes so he can be more relaxed and carefree. The old man laughed and seemed like he was very happy. He then glanced in the direction Xu Qing left. Let us go take a look at what this little wolf cub wants to do next. 1. The Lei in Captain Lei's name stands for thunder. Chapter 17, New Clothes, 1. Outside of time. During March, although spring had returned, the weather was still somewhat chilly. If Xu Qing had just exited the Forbidden Zone, the cold wouldn't matter to him. But if he was outside for too long, his body would still feel the bone-chilling cold. This was especially so during the night. The icy chill would feel heavier. As the cold wind gusted by, Xu Qing's figure didn't stop in the slightest. He merely wrapped his coat tighter around himself. He still had a mission he hadn't completed. Hence, he was carefully making his way through the campsite during the night. On his way, he saw some wild dogs that bared their teeth as they rushed at him. However, after he glared at them, it was like they could sense the smell of blood on him, so they ended up shutting up and hiding away. Xu Qing's gaze shifted away from the wild dogs as he continued on his way. After he arrived behind a house in the center ring region, he crouched in the dark and remained motionless as he stared at a large house far away. There were signs of an extinguished bonfire there. Xu Qing remembered that Fat Mountain, who separated from Horse 4, had gone there. So, he wanted to wait and see if the other party would travel out during the night. The icy chill invaded his body, but Xu Qing's body was as though it had been petrified, remaining completely motionless as he waited patiently. At this moment, behind him, on the rooftop of a building, Old Master 7th and his servant had also followed over. When he saw Xu Qing crouching there, Old Master 7th couldn't help but break into a smile. As per what I expected, this little wolf cub is going to weed out the roots. This old man is now filled with great expectations. If this brat entered the Forbidden Zone beside our camp, what performance would he show? Old Master 7th squatted down, watching with interest while speaking to the servant beside him. The servant smiled and squatted beside Old Master 7th, also surveying Xu Qing who was in the distance. Time flowed by, and after seeing an hour had passed, Xu Qing gradually frowned. After thinking about it, he turned and left, walking into the darkness. His entire person was like an apparition, coming and leaving silently. However, he didn't return to Captain Lei's residence but chose to circle the surroundings for a round. After confirming that no one was following him, Xu Qing headed back to Captain Lei's courtyard and quietly returned to his little house. After entering, he drew in a deep breath and rubbed his hands, wanting to dispel the chill in his body with the aid of this motion. He then wiped away the blood stains on his body. Only after that did he sit cross-legged on the bed with a look of pondering in his eyes. These scavengers would head out for missions at irregular timing. Luckily, Horsefor was a horny individual, so as long as not too much time has passed, no one would realize that he is dead. Fat Mountain probably wouldn't be on his guard because of this either. But for the sake of safety, it's best that I get rid of Fat Mountain as fast as possible. Xu Qing narrowed his eyes. Just like how he had killed Broken Ox back then, he who was now in the scavenger campsite wouldn't permit any concealed danger that would threaten his life. He killed Horsefor because the other party had snatched his item and threatened him. This was also the reason why he was preparing to deal with Fat Mountain. After a period of silence, Xu Qing took out Horsefor's items from the pouch and carefully inspected them. Most were miscellaneous stuff. There was also a palm-size metal plate that looked ordinary, appearing like an ingredient. Other than these, there were about 70 plus spirit coins. To Xu Qing, this was already considered a huge sum of money. He meticulously counted them once before taking out the white pills. After comparing his white pills with Horsefor's white pills, he discovered that these white pills were truly not of good quality and didn't look fresh. Hence, he began to believe 70% of the shop owner's words. After pondering for a while, Xu Qing took out one pill and swallowed it. After that, he closed his eyes to silently sense the effect. Very soon, he felt a current of warmth rising in his body. The current gathered on the mutation point on his left arm, and he began to feel a sense of comfort. After some time, this feeling disappeared. Xu Qing opened his eyes and immediately looked at his left arm. The two mutation points had grown slightly lighter in color, and the piercing pain was also reduced somewhat. It's effective. Xu Qing revealed joy in his gaze and took out the second pill to consume. The same feeling emerged. As it vanished, the sensation of piercing pain also vanished with it. He felt a sense of coolness in his body. It was very comfortable, as though his flesh and blood were being cleansed. This caused Xu Qing to sense that his speed and strength seemed to be enhanced by a little. As for the remaining white pills, he didn't continue to consume them. He placed them in his leather pouch and began to close his eyes to cultivate. The night was silent. The next morning, Xu Qing opened his eyes and rose to head out. Just when he pushed the house's door open, he saw Captain Lei sitting cross-legged in the courtyard, doing breathing exercises. Xu Qing didn't disturb him. He then opened the courtyard gate softly and carefully closed it before setting off. The wind today seemed even colder than last night. When it blew on someone, they would involuntarily shiver. Even those wild dogs were hiding in their caves, rarely venturing out. When Xu Qing breathed out, he could see mist forming, and this caused his brain to recall some unpleasant memories from when he was in the slums. He hated the cold. To homeless vagrants, the cold wind was like a calamity. One had to forcefully struggle before they could survive. At this moment, Xu Qing, who passed by a clothing shop in the cold, involuntarily halted his steps and glanced at the thick and clean clothes hanging in the shop. He gingerly touched his leather pouch before turning to enter. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Site only. The shop didn't have many customers. When Xu Qing entered, he cast his gaze on those clothes that were hanging on the wall, looking at them seriously. At the counter, the shopkeeper cast a glance at Xu Qing and wasn't too bothered as he continued instructing his staff at the side. Go and handle things at the back. Take the past month's custom-made clothes that the orderer failed to collect and hang them in front to sell. But what if the person who ordered the custom-made clothes comes back to collect them in the future? The staff hesitated, appearing to be someone new. Come back? There would be people going missing periodically in this campsite. Some died in the Forbidden Zone, and some vanished mysteriously. Only ghosts can return. Quickly go and follow my instructions. Chapter 18, New Clothes, 2. Outside of time. The shopkeeper impatiently waved his hands, and the assistant quickly ran into the back hall. Not long later, before Xu Qing had chosen his clothes, the assistant already returned with a large number of clothes in his arms. After he hung them up, Xu Qing immediately had his eyes on a deep-colored inner fur leather jacket. This was something someone custom-made but had no way to return and buy it. After the amount of time it took to finish burning an incense stick, when Xu Qing walked out of the shop, the article of clothing he was wearing was none other than that deep-colored inner fur jacket. This clothing could isolate the cold and wasn't thick or heavy. Moreover, the degree of warmth Xu Qing felt when he wore it was far greater compared to the clothes he had worn before. The only bad thing was that he was too small and skinny. So, this jacket looked like an overcoat on him. The sight of it wasn't very matching. However, Xu Qing was very happy. When he was walking on the road, he carefully avoided some places that were slightly dirty. Just when he was about to search for Fat Mountain, he noticed that there were sounds of a clamor from outside of the campsite. Also, many of the scavengers in the campsite walked out at the same time. There was a hint of anticipation in their eyes as they moved in the direction of the sounds. Xu Qing also lifted his head to look over. Gradually, under the sunlight, he saw a group of over 10 horse carriages driving over here in a majestic manner. For those seated there, even the clothing of the guards was incomparably vibrant. Their faces were rosy, and their gazes were sharp. Also, shocking fluctuations of spirit energy could be sensed from them. As for the people inside the carriage, Xu Qing couldn't see any, but he could guess that they were people with very important status. Xu Qing had also heard of such a convoy from Captain Lei before. It seemed that they would come to the campsite often for trading or to purchase the 7-leaf grass used to concoct white pills. Fat Mountain's silhouette also appeared among the crowd, and after Xu Qing's focus was attracted, he no longer paid any attention to the convoy. Instead, he narrowed his eyes and stared at Fat Mountain, starting to follow him secretly. Maybe it was because of the convoy's arrival, but the campsite today was very lively and a bazaar was created. Hence, from the start until now, Xu Qing couldn't find an opportunity. This lasted all the way until late at night. He saw Fat Mountain returning to that big house again. Thus, he could only keep the dagger in his sleeves and turn to leave. Although he had no chance to act today, Xu Qing had plenty of patience. After he returned to the small house, he wore his newly bought clothes and sat down to cultivate. Even when he was asleep, he didn't take off his new clothes. This lasted until the next morning when he was preparing to head out to find opportunities. Only then did he lovingly remove his inner fur jacket, changing back to his tattered coat. Looking at his new clothes, Xu Qing felt that he had been somewhat too impulsive yesterday. At this moment, Xu Qing wore his tattered coat and walked around the campsite. As he passed by a crowded market, his gaze seemed to be surveying the passing carriages, but he was actually searching for Fat Mountain's figure. Far away, Old Master 7th yawned and was with the servant on a rooftop. His gaze swept past the carriages and turned to Xu Qing. After that, he casually asked the servant beside him, "Have you sent the invitation to Grandmaster Bai?" "Old Master 7th, I've delivered it. But Grandmaster Bai said that he feels a little unwell recently." "Unwell? Isn't he a doctor?" "He really is, sigh. Anyway, I remember that this kid bought new clothes yesterday, but why did he change back to his old ones today?" As Old Master 7th spoke halfway, he noticed what Xu Qing was wearing, so he couldn't help but be puzzled. While Old Master 7th was puzzled, Xu Qing locked on to Fat Mountain in the crowd from the corner of his eyes. Just like this, an entire day passed as Xu Qing followed his target. As late night came, Fat Mountain, who originally wanted to return to his residence, suddenly changed his direction for an unknown reason. He actually headed to the Outer Ring region in the middle of the night. That place was comparatively more remote. "Has he discovered me?" Xu Qing frowned and narrowed his eyes. His gaze gradually became colder. He didn't continue to follow but surveyed the surroundings instead. After confirming that the other party was indeed heading there alone, he circled around and continued advancing in the darkness, reaching the outer ring in advance before Fat Mountain did. He ascertained that there were no ambushes here first. His eyes then gleamed with coldness as he hid in the darkness. And at this moment, Fat Mountain also arrived in the area, but his footsteps suddenly stopped. "Brat, I already sensed someone following me yesterday. Just come out, this place is very remote and is suitable for burying your corpse. If you don't dare to come out now, I'll no longer be alone next time. Even if Captain Lei protects you, us blood shadows will still be able to make you pay a price." Xu Qing's eyes narrowed. The other party had stated it this way, so there was no longer a need to hide. Hence, he walked out of the darkness. Horse 4 didn't secretly accept a mission and head out, right? He must have been killed by you. I have underestimated you. Fat Mountain malevolently laughed and looked at Xu Qing, who walked out. "But no worries, I've long since found him unpleasant to my eye. Even if you didn't kill him, I plan to finish him off in our next outing. So, I still have to thank you. Also, I don't care about his life or death, but there's something in his pouch that I want. It should be in your hands now, right?" Fat Mountain glanced at the leather pouch at Xu Qing's waist as a hint of greed flashed in his eyes. He didn't wait for Xu Qing to answer. His body shifted as his rotund figure actually erupted forth with a speed that exceeded the second level of qi condensation. The spirit energy fluctuations from him were much stronger than before. In fact, it even formed a layer of airflow around his body, bringing the cold wind along. His entire person was like an ice ball ramming towards Xu Qing. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Site only. He wasn't at the second level of qi condensation. From the spirit energy fluctuations at this moment, he had reached the third level. It was also precisely because of this, in addition to the item he wanted from Horsefor's pouch, that he decided to come out tonight alone. Xu Qing narrowed his eyes. This was his first time fighting a head-on battle against another cultivator. To make it even worse, the airflow barrier around Fat Mountain's body was something formed by spirit energy. Fortunately, Xu Qing was confident in both his strength and speed. Hence, at the instant the other party came near, Xu Qing also rushed out ferociously. He erupted all his strength and unleashed his maximum speed, causing his movements to leave behind some afterimages. In the blink of an eye, he dodged Fat Mountain. When Fat Mountain was clearly startled, Xu Qing had already arrived behind him. After that, he lifted his right hand and erupted forth with the entirety of his strength in a single punch. Chapter 19, New Clothes, 3. Outside of time. This was the first time Xu Qing used all his strength. This punch directly caused thunderous claps and created an explosive boom when it landed on Fat Mountain's body. As a result, Fat Mountain's entire body shuddered immensely. The air barrier formed outside his body then shattered inch by inch as his inner organs churned wildly. Pu. When the sound of coughing up a mouthful of fresh blood rang out, the killing intent in Xu Qing's eyes grew even more intense. After that, the iron stick appeared in his lifted right hand, and Xu Qing's body swayed as he brushed past Fat Mountain, who was retreating in a hurried manner. The iron stick then followed with the flow and pierced toward Fat Mountain's head. But at the next moment, Xu Qing's expression drastically changed as he decisively retreated with explosive speed. The instant he retreated, Fat Mountain's eyes revealed a hint of ruthlessness. Two black lines abruptly drilled out from his ears and flew toward Xu Qing's face one after another, producing a whooshing sound through the air. These two black lines were none other than winged centipedes. Their speed was extremely fast, and they were about to reach Xu Qing in the blink of an eye. However, Xu Qing slashed out with his dagger using his left hand and directly sliced them apart. The last one was only 7 inches away from Xu Qing's eyes when he finally killed it. This dangerous scene caused the killing intent in Xu Qing's eyes to deepen as he charged over again. During the window of opportunity created when Xu Qing retreated, the churning of Fat Mountain's inner organs also recovered somewhat. At this moment, his rotund body continued to retreat rapidly. His hands performed a set of mudras, and his face instantly flushed red. A moment later, he spat out a mouthful of poison mist at Xu Qing. The mist churned with an exceedingly large radius, floating toward Xu Qing. Everywhere the cloud of mist passed by, crackling sounds could be heard. From this, one could see how intense the poison was. After he finished doing all this, Fat Mountain's countenance was pale, and his fat belly got reduced by an entire size. He retreated once more. There was ruthlessness in his gaze along with some lingering fear. Xu Qing's strength had exceeded his expectations. He didn't expect that despite him being at the 3rd level of qi condensation, in addition to his poison attacks, he had actually failed to kill the other party in a single blow. Also, this poison mist was one of his ultimate killing techniques. If he could still do nothing to his opponent, he would have to shout for help and cause Xu Qing to feel trepidation. However, if he shouted for help, it most probably would be very difficult for him to obtain that item of horse for. Actually, he still had a taboo item he didn't use. The side effect of using this item was exceedingly great, but he still took it out. It was a piece of amber. As he hesitated in his heart, he glanced at the area that was covered in the poison mist where Xu Qing was in. However, the instant he glanced over, the poison mist suddenly started parting violently in all directions as Xu Qing's figure dashed out from it. His speed was so fast that Fat Mountain felt his eyes being dazzled. His heart pounded, and he wanted to crush the amber with his right hand and shout for help. But sadly, it was already too late. A raven black iron stick shone with incomparable sharpness and instantly penetrated his head with the ease of a hot knife going through butter. As a result, fresh blood splattered out, landing on Xu Qing at the side. Fat Mountain's body stiffened. He wanted to turn his head but failed to do so. His corpse then slowly fell to the floor and became motionless. Not glancing at Fat Mountain's body, Xu Qing panted as he warily regarded the surroundings with vigilance. This place was a remote location. After ascertaining that he didn't attract any attention, he quickly moved toward Fat Mountain's corpse and took away his leather pouch. Just when he wanted to use the poison fang, Xu Qing suddenly noticed that Fat Mountain's right hand seemed to be holding something. Hence, he pried his fingers open and saw a piece of amber that was half-cracked. This item looked ordinary and there didn't seem to be anything miraculous about this safe for the fact that there was a scorpion tail encased within. Xu Qing carefully kept it. He then melted the corpse and only left speedily after the corpse had turned into a puddle of blood. As he departed, he wiped away the bloodstains on his body and vanished into the night. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Site only. Old Master 7th and the servant walked out from the darkness at this moment. He then gazed at the location where Xu Qing vanished. Old Master 7th wasn't really concerned about the fight between Xu Qing and Fat Mountain. But after a moment of thought, he revealed a look of sudden realization. I understand why that brat didn't wear his new clothes. He must be afraid that it would be stained by blood. He must have been living in poverty and would feel heartache if the new clothes got stained. The servant who was at the side also breathed a sigh of relief. Throughout this entire day, Old Master 7th had been wondering why this brat refused to wear his new clothes. Right now, there was finally an answer. So, this meant that he didn't need to keep hearing and pondering over the reason why every time. Chapter 20, Assemble. 1. Outside of time. In the darkness of the night, Xu Qing's figure was like a cat. He proceeded forward nimbly and silently. His hand pressed against his mouth occasionally as he forcefully bore with the impulse to cough. During the first few times of this process, it was still tolerable. However, as Xu Qing continued moving, as well as with his many times suppressing the impulse, his lungs gradually felt like burning, and this caused his countenance to become paler and paler. Luckily, this place wasn't far from his residence. Besides, the campsite wasn't very large, so Xu Qing saw Captain Lei's courtyard not too long later. He didn't directly rush in. Instead, he stood at his original location and breathed deeply, trying his best to make himself seem somewhat more normal. Only then did he reduce his speed and proceed forth in a manner that was neither hasty nor slow. He pushed open the courtyard's gate. After that, Xu Qing's gaze swept through the surroundings, and he slowly entered the little house. The instant he entered, Xu Qing couldn't endure it anymore and directly coughed up a mouthful of blood. The blood was black in color, and when it landed on the ground, it actually emitted a sizzling sound. As he coughed up this mouthful of poisoned blood, Xu Qing's countenance turned somewhat more normal compared to the paleness earlier. He panted heavily and sat down cross-legged as he began to use his breathing technique. It was only a long time later that he opened his eyes. The color of his face had now recovered completely. What a fierce poison! Xu Qing mumbled. That breath of poison mist unleashed by Fat Mountain at the end contained extremely high toxicity. However, in that situation, if Xu Qing had chosen to dodge, the other party would have surely fled immediately while calling for help to attract attention. At that time, things would become much more complicated if he wanted to handle things. Besides, even if he pretended he was injured, it would most probably be very hard to swindle the cunning Fat Mountain. Ever since Fat Mountain sensed he was being followed, everything he did was to mask his intentions. His only miscalculation was his wrong estimation of Xu Qing's strength. So, at that crucial moment, Xu Qing had chosen to believe in the recovery prowess brought about by his purple crystal. He forcibly endured the invasion of the poison mist as he decided to push ahead and finish the fight quickly, taking his target's life with a single blow. From the looks of things now, his choice wasn't wrong. The purple crystal indeed possessed a very strong recovery characteristic against the invasion of poison. On his way back, the burning feeling in his lungs and the impulse to cough were actually his recovery prowess taking effect. There are indeed no simple people among scavengers. Most probably, if it wasn't for me being quick enough during my attack on Horse 4 and not giving him time to retaliate, he was going to be very hard to handle as well. Xu Qing silently mused as he started to analyze the aspects where he was insufficient during these two battles. A long time later, Xu Qing inhaled deeply and lowered his head to look at his leather pouch. A strange light then gleamed in his eyes. Fat Mountain was moving about alone because he wanted an item from Horse 4. So, he was preparing to counterhunt me and take away the item belonging to Horse 4 from me. Xu Qing opened his leather pouch and poured everything belonging to Horse 4 out, including the spirit coins. He then arranged the items before him. His gaze swept through the items, and he examined them closely. Ultimately, he eliminated the possibility of all other objects and stared at the metal plate. He frowned and couldn't be sure. In reality, Horse 4's items were all very common. Hence, this metal plate could be considered to be somewhat out of place and unknown when compared to the other items. Is it this item? But there doesn't seem to be anything marvelous about it. Could this be a very valuable ingredient? Xu Qing pondered as he kept it carefully. He prepared to find a chance in the future to find out about the origin of this item. After that, he took out Fat Mountain's leather pouch and inspected it. There were no white pills inside, but there were plenty of spirit coins. Xu Qing also found many bottles of poison. However, since he didn't know the art of poison, he didn't dare to carelessly open them. Finally, he took out the amber that was filled with cracks, recalling the appearance of that fatty who was clutching it before he died. What's this item then? It seemed that the fellow was about to crush it before he died. Xu Qing was puzzled. He felt that he lacked the relevant knowledge, so he put it away after thinking about it. After he finished doing all these, he closed his eyes and continued to cultivate. During these few days, Xu Qing discovered that after he broke through to the second level of qi condensation, the duration of his sleep didn't need to be as long as in the past. He would be able to regain his energy in just roughly 2 hours of sleep. So, he spent the vast majority of his time immersed in his cultivation. Moreover, because he didn't have any targets he needed to follow today, he cultivated even longer. In fact, he cultivated the whole day. However, when the night just descended, Xu Qing sensed something, so he opened his eyes and looked outside his house. The moment he glanced over, he heard Captain Lei's voice coming from there. "Kid, come to the courtyard." Upon hearing this, Xu Qing sat up and silently walked over as he looked at Captain Lei who was in the courtyard. There was a large table in the courtyard with some meat dishes and wine. Moreover, there were a total of 6 chairs and 6 sets of chopsticks and bowls. Captain Lei was sitting there, and he waved his hands at Xu Qing when he saw him. When Xu Qing swept his gaze across the table and sets of tableware, he had a guess in his heart. He then walked over lightly and sat beside Captain Lei. "Have you gotten familiar with the campsite during these few days?" Captain Lei glanced outside the courtyard. His attitude was casual as he spoke to Xu Qing. "Relatively so," Xu Qing replied. His gaze then swept past the food on the table. Maybe it was because he had cultivated for an entire day, or maybe the fragrance of the food was too tempting. Xu Qing soon felt his stomach making grumbling sounds. Captain Lei who was at the side laughed when he heard it. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Site only. Don't rush, wait for them. Are we waiting for the people from the Thunder team? Xu Qing had long since guessed some things in the past. Hence, he took this opportunity to ask about it. The old man nodded, and just when he was about to speak, he seemed to sense something and turned his gaze outside. At the same time, Xu Qing also sensed the same thing and followed his gaze. Outside the courtyard, in the dim streets, the figure of a burly man appeared. This burly man's muscular figure even surpassed Broken Ox. His entire person was like a small mountain, and the muscles of his body were extremely pumped, emitting a compelling aura. He carried a gigantic fine steel shield on his back and a mace that was even taller than Xu Qing in his hand. He was striding over with large steps. Chapter 21, Assemble. 2. Outside of time. The thumping sound resounded with every fall of his step, coming closer until he was outside the bamboo gate. When the bamboo gate was pushed aside, the shocking stature of a large man stepped into the courtyard. With his existence, the courtyard seemed to have shrunk a little, and the imposing aura of his tall silhouette spread even more. Xu Qing felt like he was facing a formidable mutated beast in a ruined city, and his pupils constricted. "Leader, I'm back." The large man grinned at Captain Lei, his voice muffled. When his gaze caught the food on the table, his eyes lit up. As he came closer, he cast his shield aside and threw the mace on the ground. Thereafter, he sat down right away. A hair-raising creaking sound was then emitted from the chair, as though it could hardly support the weight. From the start to the end, he didn't look at Xu Qing. It was like he didn't care. Captain Lei laughed but said nothing. Meanwhile, the large man stared at the food but didn't lift a finger. He waited quietly. As for Xu Qing, he looked at the shield and mace on the ground. From the sounds earlier, he could make an elementary judgment that the weight of these two items probably far exceeded his weight. Not long after, amid the silence within the courtyard and the streets outside the bamboo gate, two silhouettes appeared, a man and a woman. The man was a youth with a longbow on his back. He had a tall and straight figure, but he had a scar in the shape of a cross on his face. It looked as though it was forcefully carved by someone. While it was a ghastly sight, his eyes were particularly sharp. As for the woman, she looked to be around 30 years old and had an ordinary appearance. However, with the full body of tight leather clothing, her figure was very hot, emitting a type of primeval temptation. The two of them walked into the courtyard and greeted Captain Lei before sitting on the seats. After that, the youth carrying the bow shot a glance at Xu Qing as though he was examining him. On the other hand, the woman by his side had a curious look. Her tone was a little coquettish when she smiled and spoke up. "Leader, we were only out for a trip. How did you gain an extra child? You're old but strong, huh, leader? Don't tell the reason you called us here today is to let everyone know that you have an offspring but have kept it a secret from us." "The age isn't right," the burly man muttered. Xu Qing didn't speak. He shifted his left leg slightly away, allowing a smooth retrieval of the dagger tied around his calf. He felt a little uneasy. Each of these three people who came gave him a feeling that they were very strong. They felt even stronger than Fat Mountain from yesterday. This was especially so for that man with the bow. He gave Xu Qing a faint feeling of needles pricling on his back. Barbaric Ghost, the third level of body refinement *, innately born with godly strength. Captain Lei didn't bother with her joke. He only looked at Xu Qing and pointed at the burly man. Luintooth *, the third level of chi condensation, able to communicate with ferocious beasts. The wild dogs you see at the campsite are mostly her spies. Cross, the great circle of the fourth level of chi condensation, people within the same realm are hardly his match. Captain Lei introduced them one after another and then pointed to Xu Qing in front of the three people. Kid, the second level of body refinement. As Captain Lei spoke, the expressions of the three people on the team grew much more solemn. Xu Qing sat at the side and listened attentively. "Eat first. We'll talk as we eat." Captain Lei started flatly as he swept his gaze across the four of them. He then picked up a small piece of meat and ate it. "I called you all back earlier because this year's spring harvest has been brought forward. The camp leader has issued a mission, and it is about the 7-leaf grass. Apart from the original purchase value, the party with the most harvest will receive 3 clear dust pills. Its effect far exceeds that of the white pill. We can start harvesting in advance from the piece of land we hid in the Forbidden Zone. What are your opinions?" The moment Captain Lei made his speech, there was a glimmer in the eyes of Barbaric Ghost and the other two. They looked at each other and then nodded. Xu Qing had never heard of clear dust pills, but it was clear from Captain Lei's words that they were better than white pills, with superior effects. "Since you have all agreed, let us prepare. The kid will follow us on our trip into the Forbidden Zone this time around," Captain Lei said slowly. "Him." The three team members turned toward Xu Qing. Cross furrowed his brows slightly. "Leader, the second level of body refinement is too weak. It will be a little inappropriate for us to take care of him on top of completing the mission. There's a first for everyone." Captain Lei's gaze swept past Cross, and he looked toward Xu Qing. "Kid, decide for yourself." "I can do it." Xu Qing nodded. He still had 5 white pills in his pocket. Xu Qing didn't have a great need for the pills, but he understood that to live within the scavenger campsite, he would have to enter the Forbidden Zone sooner or later. If that was the case, then he could learn more by going with a team with abundant experiences. Cross fell silent, not speaking anymore. "Let's disperse after you are done eating. We will gather here tomorrow morning and set off." Once Captain Lei was done, he got up and returned to the house. Xu Qing's fork stabbed into a large piece of meat. After consuming it, he took a look at the three people and then returned to his room quickly, not wanting to stay there. Xu Qing had always stayed vigilant toward strangers from the start. It was a night of silence as the preparatory work wasn't much for Xu Qing. Because of his habit, he was at the level where he could undertake a task at lightning speed, anytime and anywhere. As such, the next morning, the group of 5 walked around the campsite under Captain Lei's lead. Today, the sky was azure blue and the sun shined brightly. In the air, a single eagle circled the campsite as if it was staring, and their figures attracted the attention of scavengers all around. 2. This was seemingly because of Barbaric Ghost's abnormally large stature coupled with Luintooth's graceful figure. Some people from the group of carriages, which had arrived a few days ago, looked toward them as well. Today, there were even more scavengers around the carriages, and it was a rare occasion for them to stand in a queue. It looked as though they were waiting. As Xu Qing didn't head out at all yesterday, he had no idea what happened. As his gaze swept across, Luan Tooth smiled and spoke up from the side. I heard someone talking last night that these carriages were from Purple Earth. There seems to be a doctor with superior medical expertise there. Yesterday, he healed the leg injury of that old pervert, Lame Jackal. So, many people queued up to have their injuries checked. That doctor must be earning quite a bit, Barbaric Ghost muttered in envy as he heard this. Xu Qing was envious too as he glanced from afar. The moment he retracted his attention, his gaze hardened slightly. Not only him, but even Barbaric Ghost and Luan Tooth's eyes sharpened in that instant. Only Cross and Captain Lei maintained their usual expression. However, upon closer look, one would be able to see the coldness in their eyes. That was because of another team gathering members ahead. There were 7 or 8 of them in that team, men and women included. Every one of them emitted a savage aura. This was especially so for one member who was an old man like Captain Lei. People were clustering around him. His hair was disheveled, and he had a bloodthirsty look in his eyes. At this moment, he was sitting atop a stray dog's corpse and eating a raw dog leg. He then said some chilling words. Go find those 2 B***stards, Horse 4 and Fat Mountain? How dare they be late for set off? They must be sick of living. It was none other than the Blood Shadow team. That old man eating the raw meat appeared to be the captain of the Blood Shadow team. His body released fluctuations of unrestrained spirit energy that caused Xu Qing, who heard these words, to squint slightly and cover the glint in his eyes. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Site only. After Luan Tooth saw the meat in the Blood Shadow team captain's hand and the dog's corpse under his body, intense rage and murderous intent filled her eyes in an instant. That was her dog. At the same time, the Blood Shadow team spotted the Thunder team too. The old man sitting on top of the dog's corpse grinned and licked his lips, looking at Luan Tooth. Little coquettish hussy, the quality of your dog's flesh is not bad. I wonder what the flesh of your body will taste like. One body refinement seemed to correspond with chi condensation, but it might be referring to the type of cultivation art they practiced. The ROS the author used was 14 for body refinement, even when he introduced the MC's cultivation level. For example, the mountains and seas art that MC is practicing is one that tempers and refines his body. 2 Luan, 2, is a mythical bird related to the Chinese phoenix. Chapter 22, Forbidden Zones Taboo, 1. Outside of time. Faced with the Blood Shadows challenge, the killing intent in Luan Tooth's gaze grew even more intense. She then looked at Captain Lei. Captain Lei's expression was just like usual, and he spoke up calmly. Cross. Hearing that, Cross picked up his bow without saying a word, instantly drawing it and shooting an arrow toward the air. He was so fast that a sharp sound was created, and the arrow instantly pierced through the eagle circling in the air like a bolt of lightning. As a result, blood burst out and the eagle let out an agonizing cry, falling. With a bang, it landed on the ground between the two groups. At the same time, the body of someone in the Blood Shadow team shook tremendously, and he spurted out a mouthful of blood. His countenance instantly turned extremely pale. That was his eagle. Unlike the dogs that Luan Tooth kept, he had integrated his spirit energy into this eagle to control it. Hence, because of the backlash effect, he received a severe injury. The other people in the Blood Shadow team instantly sent out strong killing intent, but they were stopped by the Blood Shadow team captain. The latter slowly stood up from the dog's corpse and stared at Captain Lei instead of looking at Luan Tooth. Captain Lei also looked at him coldly. The two of them stared at each other for a very long time before both let out cold snorts. Let's go, Captain Lei said calmly and continued walking forward. Luan Tooth and the others followed behind him. Xu Qing was amongst them too. He felt the great hostility between the two teams and thus turned back to take a look at those people from the Blood Shadow team. He could tell that they were waiting for Horse 4 and Fat Mountain, but it was a pity that the two of them would never appear again. Xu Qing withdrew his gaze silently and followed Captain Lei and the others, gradually leaving the campsite. The Forbidden Zone didn't seem far from the campsite, but it was still a bit of a distance to go there on foot. The group then walked for over an hour before they saw the pitch-black jungle from afar. From the outside, this stretch of Forbidden Zone jungle seemed to stretch on endlessly, and it was unknown how wide an area it covered. It was now late in the morning, and the sun was very strong. However, the jungle in the Forbidden Zone seemed to be a different world compared to the outside world. They could see a tempest gathering in the sky above the end of the jungle. The many bolts of lightning that could be seen by the naked eye were especially dazzling, giving the entire Forbidden Zone a mysterious and dangerous feeling. Xu Qing observed everything and quietly followed the group. On the way, no one in the Thunder team said a word. However, as they got closer and closer to the Forbidden Zone, Xu Qing sharply noticed that everyone's muscles were gradually tensed up. It was the same for him. This continued until the feeling of having stepped into a cold world appeared on Xu Qing's body, and all the warmth on his body was instantly removed. He had entered the Forbidden Zone. It felt as if all the scenes he saw in the normal world had been wiped out as well. The familiar bone-piercing chill awoke his memories of being in the abandoned city ruins and under the blood rain. Therefore, he took a deep breath and became extremely vigilant. He instinctively grabbed onto his iron stick tightly, just like he had done back in the ruins. What was different was that there were a lot of crumbling walls and ruined curbs in the city, but here, the trees were warped so badly that they looked like vicious ghosts, and the muddy ground was so loose that they seemed to be from hell. Also, the branches and leaves of the trees permeated out like claws and teeth covering up the sky. However, the Thunder Team's members seemed to be very familiar with this place. They carried their weapons on their back, and the path they took was clearly one they had often taken, with each step taken very meticulously. Some places seemed normal, but they would jump past them, and there were places that seemed dangerous, but they just walked through them. There were also areas from which they made a detour for no reason. This continued on and they avoided all the dangers on the way. Xu Qing followed behind them and paid attention to remember all the details. However, he also noticed some strange things. Captain Lei didn't take the lead for the entire journey. Sometimes, it'd be Barbaric Ghost and sometimes it'd be Luan Tooth. They went in rotations. Although they didn't progress at a very fast pace, other than them hearing some ferocious beasts' roars in the far distance, it had been quite safe. There were some venomous bugs, but they didn't get close after Luan Tooth had lit an incense. After they walked for about 2 hours without saying a word, they finally stopped beside a muddy place with silt and let out a sigh of relief. Xu Qing noticed that Luan Tooth had taken out some medicinal powder and scattered it into the mud. Very soon, a bunch of hostile venomous bugs came out. However, Luan Tooth kept a normal expression as she swung her hand, scattering out another type of powder. After that, the venomous bugs quickly scattered off restlessly, and the muddy spot calmed down. After completing all these, everyone squatted down and scooped up the silt with great familiarity, covering it all over their bodies. Did you remember the details on the way here? Captain Lei gestured for Xu Qing to do the same while he was spreading the silt onto his body. Xu Qing nodded and started doing the same without any hesitation. At the same time, his gaze swept past Luan Tooth. He felt that she seemed to know a little about poison techniques. The reason we jumped across certain places was because the leaves looked seriously decomposed yet were intact. This means that no ferocious beasts passed by them, and there are unknown factors that exist. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Site only. The areas we crossed through were because there were ferocious beasts' feces on the ground. Living creatures instinctively choose safe areas for excretion. Therefore, it means that there aren't any excessive dangers or mud swamps that devour humans. As for the areas we made a detour from, it's because of Barbaric Ghost's nose. His nose is sharp and can smell the scent of some dangerous mutated beasts. You'll learn many things on this journey, so just try to remember whatever you can. Hearing this, Xu Qing looked at Barbaric Ghost. Barbaric Ghost also turned his head at this moment and bared his teeth to smile at Xu Qing. As for this silt, it's a place that our team found many years ago. It contains the shed skin of night lizards. Not only will we be able to cover our scents after wiping them all over our bodies, but it'll also instill fear in other creatures to a certain degree. The place we're headed to is further forward. To the north is the venomous dragon swamp. The different terrains in the Forbidden Zone jungle have been segregated into multiple areas by the scavengers. The venomous dragon swamp is one of them, but this time around, we aren't going there. As Captain Lei said all these, he had covered his entire body with the silt. Chapter 23, Forbidden Zones Taboo, 2. Outside of time. Xu Qing was also done. When he got up, Cross, who walked past him, despite doubting whether it was a good decision for Xu Qing to tag along with them earlier, still chose to speak out, albeit with an indifferent expression. Pay more attention to your mutation points. The density of anomalous substances in the Forbidden Zone is very dense, so you must pay constant attention to it. Once the mutation goes over the limit, no one can save you? Xu Qing nodded. He had noticed this point long ago. He could sense that the density of anomalous substances in this Forbidden Zone was extremely high, but it was a lot weaker when compared to the peak in the city ruins. However, he had now accumulated quite a lot of anomalous substances in his body, so even though he wasn't cultivating now, the mutation point on his arm was starting to give him a faint piercing pain just from him breathing. Therefore, he took out a white pill and put it in his mouth. He didn't swallow it but kept it in his mouth to let it slowly melt. Very soon, everyone was done covering themselves with the silt. They checked out each other and then continued on their way. However, things were a little different from before. Their travel speed became even slower, and everyone had their weapons drawn. Xu Qing glanced at their weapons. Barbaric Ghost's weapons were a fine steel shield and a mace, Captain Lei's weapons were a pair of boxing gloves, Cross's was a longbow, and Luan Tooth took out a serrated dagger that shone with a cold gleam. When Xu Qing had gone out a few days ago to Tail Fat Mountain, he had other gains too. Due to his sharp hearing, he had heard a lot of conversations between scavengers and learned a lot of information he didn't know of in the past. For example, he already knew that weapons were classified into magic treasures, runic treasures, and ordinary treasures. Amongst them, magic treasures were considered legendary and extremely rare. Rumor had it that each magic treasure had a different degree of anomalous substances within, and the amount of anomalous substances would increase with usage, being extremely hard to eliminate. Therefore, they were practically non-renewable resources. In addition, their might was exceptional, and thus they were considered extraordinarily precious. This led to the birth of unique existences like treasure nurturers. They tended to be kept from a young age, using their bodies to dilute the magic treasure's anomalous substances. Captain Lei had mentioned this in the past. Apart from magic treasures, there were also runic treasures and ordinary treasures. Although runic treasures were also rare, they were more attainable compared to magic treasures. Last but not least, ordinary treasures were commonly seen. They tended to be weapons that were forged from unique materials and could be used by ordinary people as well. Xu Qing felt that his iron stick might be an ordinary treasure, and what these people were using was clearly of the same category. Time passed by slowly and Xu Qing followed the Thunder team, entering deeper and deeper into the Forbidden Zone. They did encounter some troubles on their way, but the troubles were nothing major. Barbaric Ghost was enough to deal with them by himself. When they occasionally encountered some stronger ferocious beasts, Cross's bow would fire intensely. As for Luin Tooth, her attacks were mainly spells. She seemed to be able to perform some intimidating skills that caused the ferocious beasts to pause in their movements and become less agile. There was also once when Xu Qing attacked. He grabbed a venomous snake that shot out from behind them and crushed it. After Xu Qing had done this, Cross also noticed during their journey that Xu Qing was able to keep up with them without making any newbie mistakes. Hence, there was less judgment in his gaze when looking at Xu Qing. He also imparted to him some of his experience. Kid, this forbidden zone might seem dangerous, but to us people who are veterans here, as long as we don't encounter 3 types of situations, we're basically safe. You must remember these 3 situations. The first one is the encounter of unfamiliar mutated beasts from the depths of the forbidden zone heading to the outer area. Such situations aren't common and our activity areas are basically on the outer edges. However, the moment we encounter one, it'll be extremely dangerous. It's because we only understand the habits and abilities of the mutated beasts on the outer edges. Moreover, the Forbidden Zone is too big and there are various mutated beasts in it with different abilities. If we aren't careful, we'll die. The second type is singing voice. At the mention of this, Cross revealed a wary expression. There's a saying that a singing voice appears in this place, and not a single person out of 100 who heard the voice can survive. However, I have never heard it before. Among us, the only one in our team who has heard it is Captain Lei. Xu Qing looked toward Captain Lei. Captain Lei didn't say anything but looked into the depths of the Forbidden Zone with a hint of complication in his eyes. Let me talk about the third one. Luin Tooth, who was at the side, smiled and said. She took a look at Xu Qing. Kid, the third type of danger here is very commonly seen. It's labyrinth fog. When labyrinth fog appears, it's like one is blinded and loses their way. Moreover, the labyrinth fog usually exists for a very long time. Once a person loses their way in here and can't find their way out, the anomalous substances in the fog will corrode them, causing the anomalous substances in their body to gradually rise. This also tends to represent that death is coming. However, there are 2 ways to deal with this. One is fire, while the other is coming from people who were either born with or cultivated to gain strong mental energy. The former doesn't tackle the problem from the roots. Although fire can drive the labyrinth fog away within a small range, allowing one to regain vision, the labyrinth fog is mysterious and it's hard for fire to sustain for long. As for the latter, they are very rare and there might only be one in the campsite in a few decades. People like these tend to leave very quickly as they have better room for growth elsewhere. There's a 4th type of danger, and that is encountering malicious sneak attacks from hostile enemies. Barbaric Ghost, who was leading the group, said gloomily. Luin Tooth was about to say something. However, Captain Lei, who was looking far away, suddenly changed his expression and let out a low bellow. Quiet. At the next instant, Cross drew his bow, Luin Tooth's eyes revealed a cold gleam, and Barbaric Ghost's muscles tensed up. Xu Qing's hair instantly stood up. A strong sense of danger suddenly emitted out from the pitch-black jungle in the far distance. Very soon, streams of cold light appeared in the darkness. They were many pairs of eyes, which looked at them with indifference and coldness. There were exceptionally a lot of eyes. With the appearance of these eyes, many huge wolves with the size of water buffaloes and black scales growing all over their bodies walked out slowly. There were at least several dozen of them. Moreover, there seemed to be even more of them in the far distance, and the numbers might be in the hundreds. Upon sensing that each wolf emitted the energy around the 2nd level, Barbaric Ghost and the others' countenances changed. Black-scaled wolf pack. They usually only live near the boundaries between the depths and the outer edges of the Forbidden Zone. Why did they come here? Cross's pupils contracted and Luin Tooth's face also turned a little pale. They were very clear that although one black-scaled wolf might not be much, wolves in such large numbers would be a harsh trial for them. Most importantly, the density of anomalous substances in the Forbidden Zone was very strong. If one were to deplete too much spirit energy in their bodies, they could only absorb spirit energy from the surroundings for replenishment. During the battle, they wouldn't be able to separate the anomalous substances. If that was the case, the anomalous substances in their bodies would accumulate extremely quickly and the risk of mutation would be magnified. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Site only. Xu Qing's breathing also hastened slightly. The pressure coming from the wolf pack was tremendous. You guys, retreat first. I'll stay here and obstruct them. Amidst everyone's shaken state, Captain Lei spoke up in a deep voice and walked out slowly. At this moment, a spirit energy wave that surpassed Cross's by at least a fold erupted as Captain Lei stepped forward. The wolf pack also paused in their footsteps, all of them staring at Captain Lei. Chapter 24, Evil Shadow, 1. Outside of time. Let's go. Cross's gaze swept across the Thunder team and backed off decisively. Luin Tooth and Barbaric Ghost, who were next to him, also retreated rapidly. Xu Qing narrowed his eyes and watched as Captain Lei walked toward the wolf pack. Spirit energy burst out from all over his body and created a sense of intimidation for the wolf pack. Xu Qing didn't move his feet but raised his iron stick slightly as a cold glimmer flickered at the iron stick's tip. Kid, do you know why Captain Lei is the captain? Cross's voice rang out from a distance after he had leaped away. It's not just because Captain Lei's 6th level of Qi condensation cultivation realm far surpasses ours, but even more so because of his ability to assume responsibilities and his decisive judgment in the face of danger. The moment Cross's voice rang out, a loud boom echoed out as well. It was a big tree that was 200 jogs away that was broken by Cross's bow and fell to the ground. Barbaric Ghost and Luin Tooth did the same thing as well. Many big trees now toppled over, forming a barrier. After leaving a space like an entryway, Cross and Luin Tooth didn't stop and started running once again. Only Barbaric Ghost, who held a shield and mace, stayed behind, leaning against a big tree. He resembled a small mountain as he guarded the small path. At the same time, Captain Lei abruptly erupted forth with strength, his hands releasing a piercing dazzle as he charged into the wolf pack. Every time he passed through and had contact with the wolf pack, there'd definitely be flesh and blood breaking down and horrible deaths. However, the wolf pack was too large, and Captain Lei's figure was quickly engulfed. There were only sounds of explosions and wolf howls that kept ringing out. Cross, who was in the distance, also appeared at this moment as he let out a low bellow. Kid, come over and meet up with us. There'll be a time for you to fight. Xu Qing made a call that this was the Thunder Team's battle plan and thus stopped hesitating and ran straight to where the Barbaric Ghost was at. Barbaric Ghost grinned and pointed to the entryway behind him. Xu Qing then took a look at him and darted through the gap, chasing after Cross and Luin Tooth who were far away. Very soon, he saw Luin Tooth, who was busy clearing up an area and using trees to put up blockage around it. She then took out a lot of powder and scattered them on the sides. After that, she even bit through her finger and drew a diagram that no outsiders would understand on the ground with her blood. After noticing Xu Qing, she didn't have the time to say anything and only used her gaze to gesture for him to hurry up and move. Xu Qing glanced over and passed by her quickly without any hesitation. He continued on until he was 200 jongs away behind Luin Tooth, and he finally saw Cross who was crouching on top of a large tree. This tree was extremely large, as though it was a vantage point that could allow one to have complete vision over the entire shopping mode battlefield. Cross, who was squatting there, watched as Xu Qing quickly got close before he spoke in a low and deep voice. You'll take charge of the area that is beyond 200 jongs behind me. Xu Qing nodded heavily, understanding the Thunder Team's battle plan. He swiftly moved over and when he reached the 200 jongs range, he immediately scanned the surroundings. He didn't make any changes to the environment but hid in the slit beneath a shrub. This was like how he had been hunting in the city ruins back then, remaining completely immobile. At the instant he hid, an even more intense explosion rang out. With the trees covering his vision, Xu Qing couldn't see the scene beyond 800 jongs away. However, he could sense that the battle was very intense. In fact, this was how it was. At this moment, Captain Lei's figure charged out from the wolf pack 800 jongs away from Xu Qing. Even though he was at the 6th level of Qi condensation, it was hard for him not to be in a bit of a battered state when he couldn't overdeplete himself. Thankfully, he had great control of his spirit energy. He saved half of his spirit energy and retreated toward where Barbaric Ghost was while being chased by the black-scaled wolves. Barbaric Ghost smiled sinisterly and raised the mace in his hand. The moment Captain Lei jumped past him, he smashed the mace fiercely toward the pursuing black-scaled wolves. Cross, who was at the highest spot, also focused his vision at this instant, suddenly drawing his strong bow. Many arrows formed from spirit energy whistled sharply, leaving wind marks as they landed on the wolf pack to support Barbaric Ghost. When the cries rang out once again, Captain Lei had left the place where Barbaric Ghost was and moved close to Luin Tooth. Behind him, Barbaric Ghost was alone, blocking everything like a mountain. Just like that, Xu Qing, who had hidden himself in the slit, saw that the first to return was Captain Lei, who had dashed past Luin Tooth and Cross. Captain Lei sped past Xu Qing and threw a glance at Xu Qing's hiding spot from the corner of his eyes. He didn't have any time to speak, so he just nodded. He then headed 200 jongs away and sat down cross-legged as he swallowed a white pill to meditate. While reconditioning himself, he also made preparations for the next round of fighting. This was the Thunder Team's retreat plan. As the strongest one amongst them, Captain Lei was the first to stop the wolves while Barbaric Ghost was the second line of defense. When Barbaric Ghost was almost out of energy, he would retreat and the mission to stop the wolf pack would be left for Luin Tooth to continue, followed by Cross. The cycle would repeat like this. This would allow them each to have their own rest time. This was the most suitable cooperative battle method for teams in forbidden zones where the density of anomalous substances was very high, out of which, the ones who felt the most fatigued were Captain Lei and Cross. The former had to spend the most time holding back the wolves and killing most of them, fighting for more time for his teammates at the back. As for the latter, other than having to do his part in the cycle, he also had to be the safety assurance from the highest point when his teammates were retreating. It could be said that everyone's position was very important, and the most important thing was their cooperation and trust. Is this what a scavenger's team is like? Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Sight only. Xu Qing's gaze was firm and he continued to hide without moving. As time passed, he soon saw Barbaric Ghost panting and moving nearer. A short moment later, he then saw Luin Tooth clutching her chest while having a pale countenance. The last one to pass by him was Cross. His countenance was cold and appeared normal, but Xu Qing still sensed that Cross's spirit energy had almost depleted. The densely packed wolf pack howled and was giving chase behind him. When Cross passed Xu Qing by, he seemed a little hesitant. Chapter 25, Evil Shadow, 2. Outside of time. I can do it. Xu Qing saw the other party's unspoken meaning and said in a deep voice. Cross didn't say anything and left. An instant later, the wolf pack came surging over. The wind that kicked up blew past Xu Qing's face, bringing along a stench. The 10 or so wolves who were at the very front had pitch-black bodies and crimson eyes that emitted viciousness and craziness. Clearly, the first cycle of Thunder Team's battle arrangement had caused these wolves to suffer quite a bit of casualties. Stimulated by the blood, these black-scaled wolves became incomparably berserk. At this moment, they seemed to not have noticed the hidden Xu Qing and wanted to chase after Cross. However, the instant they got near, a dagger suddenly flew out. With a whooshing sound, the dagger pierced into the forehead of the black-scaled wolf at the very front. It was with such great strength that the dagger instantly pierced through the wolf's head. This black-scaled wolf let out an agonizing cry and died instantly. As his corpse landed due to inertia, Xu Qing's figure shot out like a bolt of lightning. The raven black iron stick flashed with a cold gleam, fiercely piercing into the eyes of another black-scaled wolf, penetrating the head. After that, Xu Qing's body swung and he clenched his left hand into a fist, smashing it toward the third wolf at the back who was pouncing on him for a sneak attack. The wolf head was instantly smashed and blood splattered all over Xu Qing. After killing the third wolf, Xu Qing's figure moved once again. His speed was perfectly displayed at this moment. He was extremely agile, like a massacring Rakshasa star. He was moving through the wolf pack with an icy gaze, attacking decisively. As the black iron stick gleamed, many black-scaled wolves' agonizing howls rang out and spread to the surroundings. Blood from more and more wolves got onto him and his hands were also dyed red. Although it felt sticky, his grip on the iron stick was still firm. At this moment, even the color of the iron stick had turned crimson. However, because the wolf pack was scattered, some still managed to pass by him. Some of their claws and fangs also left marks on his body. However, with Xu Qing's speed, he managed to charge out and somehow stopped the wolf pack. As for his injuries, his purple crystal's terrifying recovery abilities displayed amazing effects during this battle. All of his external injuries quickly healed in a few breaths worth of time. Even the wounds that were more serious stopped bleeding. Because his entire body was covered by wolf's blood, other people wouldn't be able to see this clearly. Compared to his wounds recovery, his stamina recovery was even more terrifying. Hence, his battle prowess was sustained to a shocking extent. Gradually, his surroundings were covered by wolf corpses. At this moment, the coldness in his eyes deepened, and his battle duration exceeded everyone else's, causing the wolf pack to show a hint of being somewhat intimidated. When seen from afar, when the sunlight streamed through the densely packed tree leaves and landed on his body that was covered in blood, the refracted light seemed to turn him into a blood glow. This scene was also seen by Captain Lei who was 200 jongs away, as well as Cross who was at a vantage point. The two of them were shocked by Xu Qing's ruthlessness and tenacity. "Kid, retreat," Captain Lei suddenly said. Xu Qing still had some strength left, but he could also feel the serious depletion of his spiritual energy. Although the purple crystal could recover his stamina and heal his injuries, the consumption of spirit energy couldn't be compensated. Fortunately, he was a body refiner, unlike Luan Tooth who wouldn't be able to act the moment she exhausted her spirit energy. However, he was still affected somewhat, and this caused him to have no choice but to absorb the spirit energy from the surroundings that had dense anomalous substances in them. At this moment, the piercing pain in his arm's mutation points became increasingly intense. Therefore, after hearing Captain Lei's words, Xu Qing didn't hesitate and immediately backed off. The instant he did so, a black-scaled wolf with eyes that weren't completely red but had one black eye instead, leaped up and pounced towards Xu Qing. Upon seeing this, a cold glint flashed in Xu Qing's eyes, and his iron stick transformed into a bloody arc that suddenly pierced through the wolf's head. He then wanted to continue retreating, but at this moment, under the spotted sunlight, he had no idea if what he saw was an illusion, but the shadow of this fallen black-scaled wolf seemed to have become distorted. It then rapidly extended out of the ground toward where Xu Qing was at. Right now, the sunlight on the ground was mottled and not strong, so he was unable to ascertain what he was seeing at the first instant. At the next moment, that shadow came into contact with his body. After that, Xu Qing's body violently trembled. An evil intent that was hard to describe wanted to invade his entire body. However, at this moment, something happened to the purple crystal, which hadn't done anything thus far other than providing recovery abilities. At this moment, it suddenly vibrated and a cold stream erupted from it. With the eruption, the feeling of being invaded by evil intent instantly disappeared. This cold stream came quickly but also vanished equally quickly, disappearing without a trace in the blink of an eye. The purple crystal then returned to how it normally was, remaining completely motionless. Xu Qing was stunned, but he didn't have time to overthink it for now. After his body recovered, he quickly backed off. The scene earlier had happened in an instant, so neither Captain Lei nor Cross, who was far away, noticed anything amiss. Right now, as Xu Qing retreated, Captain Lei came over. His gaze still had hints of astonishment in them. "You've done a good job. Hurry up and go to the back to get some rest." The black-scaled wolves prowl the depths of the Forbidden Zone. They like places with a high density of anomalous substances, and the outer areas have lower anomalous substance density in comparison. Therefore, no matter why they came here, they don't like this place. As long as they aren't able to win after a prolonged fight, they'll definitely leave. After saying that, Captain Lei erupted forth with all of his spirit energy and charged out toward the black-scaled wolves that were chasing Xu Qing. Barbaric Ghost's figure also arrived rapidly. He had clearly been waiting at the back for a very long time, so he grew anxious. When he saw Xu Qing covered in blood as well as the countless wolf corpses not far away, he inhaled and went forward, wanting to help Xu Qing. I'm fine. Xu Qing didn't let Barbaric Ghost help him but turned to take a look at Captain Lei instead. He then quickly left under Barbaric Ghost's respectful gaze. When he passed by Luan Tooth, she seemed to have received the news as well, and her gaze had a hint of shock in them when looking at Xu Qing. After giving it some thought, she took out a leather pouch and tossed it to him. Xu Qing took it and felt the shape of alchemy pills inside. He understood what they were and thus thanked Luan Tooth. He then quickly left under Luan Tooth's gaze until he saw Cross. Cross was on a tree and didn't make a sound. He nodded at Xu Qing with apparent recognition in his eyes. Xu Qing didn't say anything either and gently nodded as a gesture. After he went to the very back, he found a place to sit down. He then exhaled a breath of turbid air and took out 3 white pills to swallow. As the alchemy pills melted, he started to absorb spirit energy from the surroundings for replenishment. Time flowed by, and Xu Qing opened his eyes an hour later. His mental fatigue seemed to have eased a little, but he still had a hint of perplexity in his gaze. He noticed that the anomalous substances in his body didn't seem to be much. Therefore, he rolled up the sleeve of his left arm. Now, the perplexity in his eyes instantly turned into shock. To think that he had 1 fewer mutation point on his arm? However, his cultivation realm was clearly at the 2nd level of body refinement. Moreover, after having experienced the killings earlier, not only was he not weakened, but he seemed to have become stronger after his recovery. He remembered very clearly that he had passively absorbed spirit energy during the slaughter, and he had felt piercing pain from the 2 mutation points on his arm. As for the white pills, it wasn't as if Xu Qing hadn't eaten them before. Their effects shouldn't be this amazing. However, there didn't seem to be any other explanations for his situation, other than what had taken place in the instant the purple crystal released a cold stream. Shadow, evil intent, crystal erupting cold stream. Xu Qing narrowed his eyes and recalled the strange scene from earlier. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Sight only. He was certain that it wasn't his eyes playing tricks on him when he saw a shadow coming into contact with him. It wasn't an illusion from the scattered sunlight either. Therefore, he carefully thought back on the scene of the crystal erupting with a cold stream. It was as if at that instant, the evil intent that attacked him was washed off and absorbed into the crystal. Was it eaten up? Xu Qing guessed, feeling a little surprised. Footnote. 1 Rakshasa is a type of demon or goblin in Hindu mythology.